Whispers in the snow, why some trails never speaks. Some trails are walked, not to arrive anywhere, but simply to feel the crunch beneath our feet, the hush of falling snow, and the quiet invitation of questions that never asked to be answered. There are places where footprints vanish mid-path, where cabins are left warm but empty, where voices once echoed across glaciers, now long stilled. These stories do not shout for our attention, they whisper. They do not demand resolution, they offer reflection. And perhaps that's why they stay with us, not in the part of our mind that seeks facts, but in the part that longs for wonder. In this journey, we won't unravel history, we will walk beside it, through the snowfields of forgotten expeditions, the frozen silence of vanished settlements, and the strange patterns nature leaves when no one is looking. Each chapter in this series is a step further into that soft unknown, to disturb it, but to feel it, because sometimes not knowing is gentler than knowing. Sometimes a quiet presence is more comforting than a loud answer. And, in the deep calm of these mysteries, we discover something else, a stillness inside ourselves. So, if the world around you feels too sharp, too fast, too loud, pause here with us. Let the cold become calm, let the unsolved become soothing, and let these tales settle like snowfall around your thoughts. We are not chasing endings, we are honoring echoes, and in this space of unhurried wonder, even the coldest stories can warm us in a different way. You are welcome here not to solve, but to rest, not to awaken, but to dream. Let us begin in silence, with a whisper in the snow. Dyatlov Pass, 1959, 9 hikers lost in the Ural night. The original enigma, footprints in deep snow. A slashed tent, bodies found miles apart, no final clue, in the soft stillness of the Ural mountains. Under a heavy cloak of snow and silence, the story of 9 hikers slowly unfolds, not with answers, but with quiet, unyielding mystery. In February of 1959, a group of experienced mountaineers set out on a trek they had planned with discipline and care, stepping into a vast, icy wilderness under grey skies. They were young, skilled, and prepared, each one a thread in the tight fabric of a team that shared laughter, music, and a purpose. Yet somewhere on the slopes of Kholat Syakhl, what the local Mansi people called the Mountain of the Dead, something broke the silence, and none of them would return. Days passed with no contact. When search teams finally arrived, what they found was not a disaster in the usual sense, but a scene that stirred unease. The hikers' tent had been slashed from the inside. Their belongings, warm clothes, boots, tools, were left untouched. Footprints led away barefoot into the snow. Then, scattered over a distance, the bodies began to appear. Some were lightly dressed, curled beside trees as though seeking warmth. Others were found much farther, with injuries that didn't match any obvious event. One had fractured ribs without bruises, another a missing tongue, yet no sign of struggle. The snow was undisturbed around them, as though whatever occurred had moved like wind-quick, invisible, absolute. There were no answers, only more questions. Was it the crushing force of a rare avalanche? A sudden rush of wind strong enough to panic even trained hikers? Theories have gathered like frost ever since. Secret military experiments, infrasound-induced fear, local folklore, and even cosmic events. But none fit perfectly. What remains is not the need for conclusion, but the weight of what's missing. In their final photos, the hikers smile under thick hats and fur-lined coats, unaware of what the mountain held for them. Their journal entries speak of cold, of snowdrifts, of unity. Their last camp, their final steps, are now preserved in official records, yet they speak only in quiet riddles. Today, when one stands at the foot of that pass, renamed in honor of Dyatlov, the wind still moves through the trees in hushed tones, brushing against memorials and frozen ground. And in that silence, the mountain keeps its calm watch over the place where 9 lives slip gently from one world into another, leaving behind not noise, but a quiet absence that lingers like the last footprints on fresh snow, slowly fading with time. Franklin's Arctic Dream, 1845, The Lost Expedition of Sir John Franklin. 2 ships, 129 men, vanished under drifting ice. Decades later, relics and bones hint at starvation and lead poisoning and the long pale light of the Arctic summer, too. Ships known as HMS Erebus and HMS Terror slipped quietly into the icy waters of Baffin Bay in 1845, carrying with them the hopes of an empire, the dreams of discovery, and 129 souls bound for the Northwest Passage. Under the command of Sir John Franklin, seasoned explorer and naval officer, the mission was bold but elegant in its design, to finally map a navigable route through the frozen crown of the world, connecting Atlantic to Pacific through a channel long whispered about by cartographers and merchants alike. The ships were outfitted with the most advanced technology of the time, including steam engines and reinforced hulls, and their provisions included 3 years of food and comfort items like books, instruments, and even a hand organ to ease long winters. And yet, shortly after entering Lancaster Sound, the expedition disappeared into silence. For years, the world knew nothing, no letters, no survivors, only a growing emptiness where their story should have continued. As search parties fanned across the Arctic, driven by grief and imperial pride, scattered clues began to appear like shadows on snow. Inuit testimony, long ignored but quietly consistent, spoke of white men seen dragging sledges and dying slowly in the cold. Fragments of equipment, buttons, and torn pieces of uniform surfaced, but never enough to complete the puzzle. Then, decades later, a handwritten note was found beneath a stone cairn on King William Island. It began optimistically, dated 1847, reporting all well. But scrawled in the margins was a second message from 1848 brief, clipped, tragic. The ships had been trapped in ice for over a year. Franklin was dead, and the surviving crew had abandoned the vessels to begin a desperate march southward. What happened next is still unclear. Some succumbed to the cold, others starved or fell ill, possibly from lead poisoning due to poorly soldered food tins. A few skeletal remains showed signs of cut marks, leading to speculations of survival cannibalism, though such ideas remain debated and often sensationalized. Yet what endures more powerfully than those theories is the immense silence the expedition left behind. The ships themselves remained lost until the 21st century, when Erebus and Terror were discovered, eerily preserved in the icy depths, their cabins frozen in time, as if still waiting for orders that would never come. Today, in the windswept barrens of Canada, Asiatic archipelago, the memory of Franklin's dream lingers like a frost-covered melody, half forgotten but deeply embedded in the northern soul. It is not the tragedy that haunts, but the quiet perseverance of those men, moving through a world of white silence, their boots crunching softly over snow no one had mapped, believing, still, in the promise of a path ahead. Their story rests, not in the drama of their disappearance, but in the calm dignity of their attempt and the soft echo of their presence that drifts, even now, through the endless Arctic wind. Scott's final march, 1912, racing death on the Antarctic plateau. Captain Scott's Terra Nova team reached the pole only to perish on the return, leaving diaries that whisper frostbite and devotion in the vast white silence of Antarctica, where the wind whispers like an ancient breath across the endless plateau. A group of 5 men trudged slowly through the snow in 1912, each step a small defiance against the cold that sought to still them. They were part of the British Terra Nova expedition, led by Captain Robert Falcon Scott, a naval officer whose quiet determination masked a soul shaped by duty, wonder, and the haunting pull of polar dreams. For years, Antarctica had called to explorers like a frozen enigma, daring them to trace its boundaries, map its heart, and perhaps stand, just for a moment, at the bottom of the world. Scott's goal was simple yet monumental: to be the first to reach the South Pole. But the ice was not a place for pride or haste. It demanded patience, reverence, and, often, sacrifice. The journey south began with optimism and camaraderie. The sledges loaded with provisions, the ponies and dogs straining against the snow. Each day was marked not by the sun, which refused to rise or set, but by the quiet rituals of survival: boiling snow for tea, checking frost-bitten fingers, writing a few words into a leather-bound diary that might one day tell the story. They moved slowly through a land of wind-sculpted silence, past blue crevasses that yawned like frozen sighs, under skies that seemed to hold their breath. And then, on January 17th, 1912, after months of grinding travel, Scott and his 4 companions reached the Po only to find a small black flag fluttering weakly in the wind. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, had arrived there 34 days earlier. The disappointment was profound, not for glory lost, but for the deeper ache of having given so much only to arrive second in a place where the ice did not care who came first. Still, they stood together, solemn and dignified, took photographs, and began the return journey. But Antarctica, indifferent to human dreams, began to press in. The temperatures dropped sharply, their rations thinned. One by one, the men faltered. Edgar Evans, already suffering from injuries, collapsed near the Beardmore Glacier. Lawrence Oates, plagued by frostbite and weakness, famously stepped out of the tent into a blizzard, whispering that he may be some time. His act was not born of despair, but of deep, wordless loyalty to lighten the burden for his companions. The others pressed on, their strength dwindling like the fading sun. Scott, Henry Bowers, and Edward Wilson dug a final snow shelter just 11 miles from a supply depot they would never reach. There, in that small tent, wrapped in their sleeping bags, they waited not with panic or desperation, but with an aching kind of peace. Scott wrote in his journal until the very end. His final entries, scrawled with trembling hands, speak not of blame or bitterness, but of affection, resolve, and a strangely calm acceptance. We are weak, writing is difficult, but for my own sake I do not regret this journey, he wrote. Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell, but surely a great tale. And so they remained, wrapped in the hush of snow and silence, as the Antarctic wind buried their story beneath drifts of time. When their tent was found months later, it was as if time had paused. Their journals lay beside them, carefully arranged, a testament to the quiet nobility with which they faced the inevitable. The world mourned, not just the loss of life, but the grandeur of spirit. Scott's story did not end in failure. It became something deeper, more enduring. It became a meditation on endurance, friendship, purpose, and the kind of courage that is not loud or defiant, but still thoughtful and deeply human. The Antarctic remains unchanged, vast and unmoved, but within its frozen heart lies the faint imprint of footsteps, and within its silence, the echo of a final march carried not on the winds of victory, but on the quiet breath of devotion and dignity. Mallory and Irvine, 1924. Everest's greatest unanswered climb. George Mallory's body found in 1999. Did he summit before falling, or did Everest claim him outright? In the hushed realm where Earth stretches its fingertips toward the sky, where oxygen thins and silence grows thick, there stands a peak so vast, so immovable, that it has stirred the human spirit for generations with both reverence and longing. Mount Everest Sagarmatha to the Nepali, Chamalungma to the Tibetans rises, like a frozen question from the spine of the Himalayas. Its summit often hidden behind wind-blown snow and dreams half-told. It was in this space, between the known and the unknowable, that two men, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine, disappeared in 1924. They were part of the third British expedition to conquer Everest, a time when the mountain was still unclimbed and its slopes were scantily mapped. Their journey was not adorned with modern gear or GPS, but rather with wool garments, hobnailed boots, and the kind of quiet determination that comes not from conquest, but from a deep-seated yearning to touch something unreachable. On June 8th, from a high camp on the North Ridge, Mallory and Irvine began their final push toward the summit. They were seen through a telescope by teammate Noel Odell, high on the mountain, going strong for the top before disappearing into the mist. And then nothing. The mountain, as it always has, held its silence. No cries were heard, no signs followed. The years passed. Expeditions came and went. The summit was eventually reached in 1953 by Hillary and Tenzing, but the quiet question remained: had Mallory and Irvine stood atop the world nearly 3 decades earlier? For much of the 20th century, they remained myth more than memory. Mallory, with his poet's soul and aristocratic bearing, had once answered the question of why climb Everest, with the now famous phrase, "because it is there." Yet, those 4 words, often quoted, feel more like a whisper than a proclamation, a gentle reminder of the human need to rise, not to conquer, but to understand. As the decades drifted on, Everest changed. More climbers came, routes became better known, technology advanced, but somewhere beneath the snow, a story remained untold. In 1999, a dedicated team set out not to summit, but to search. They scoured the northern face with quiet care, seeking not glory but answers. And there, at 26,760 feet, they found him. George Mallory lay face down on a rocky slope, preserved by the cold. His skin, parchment pale, clung to bone. His goggles were in his pocket, suggesting it was night or a storm when he fell. There was rope trauma around his waist, evidence of a fall, perhaps even a separation from Irvine. But most haunting of all, his camera was missing, the one he likely carried to capture the summit if reached. The discovery answered one question, but birthed a dozen more. Where was Irvine? Did they reach the top and fall on the way down, or were they lost in the final attempt? No summit photo was ever recovered, no definitive proof, just the mountain's enduring silence. And yet, there is a gentle wonder in that. Mallory's body, found resting just beneath the stars, becomes less a relic of a failed climb and more a symbol of eternal ascent. The mountain did not claim him in cruelty. but perhaps accepted him as part of itself, a soft merging of ambition and landscape. In his pockets were simple things: a letter from his wife, a monogrammed handkerchief, and a piece of cotton cloth embroidered with a cross. These were not the trophies of conquest, but the quiet tokens of a man whose journey was as inward as it was upward. Irvine remains unfound, his final resting place still somewhere, amidst the wind-swept ridges and ice-locked gullies of the North Face. Some believe he holds the key to the mystery, perhaps with the missing camera, perhaps with his own story sealed into the snow. But Everest does not rush to reveal. It teaches us in silences, not declarations. Whether they summited or not may matter less than how they climbed with resolve, with wonder, with the grace of those who carry both fear and hope together in fragile balance in the calm spaces between snowfall and memory. Their footsteps linger not as frozen moments of ambition, but as reminders of the beautiful unknowability that still exists in the world. Not every question is meant to be answered. Some are meant to drift, like soft snow across a high ridge, suspended just above understanding. Mallory and Irvine's climb becomes a lullaby for the dreamers, a story not of defeat, but of the human spirit moving upward against the weight of time. And in the endless hush of Everest, their memory remains not as a tale of loss, but as a quiet offering to mystery itself. Chapter 6: Greely's Lady Franklin Rescue. 1883. A mail station that never heard bells in the frozen north, where time itself seems to slow beneath blankets of snow and silence. There are places the sun touches only gently, and stories that unfold not in shouts, but in slow, quiet unravelings. One such story belongs to a group of men led by Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, a scientific officer in the U.S. Army, who in 1881 embarked on an expedition to Lady Franklin Bay in the Canadian Arctic. This was no grand voyage of conquest, nor a fevered hunt for treasure. Instead, it was part of the first International Polar Year, a peaceful collaboration among nations to learn about the Earth's polar regions, its weather, magnetic fields, and currents of air and sea. The Greely expedition set sail with noble intent, armed not with weapons, but with instruments, barometers, thermometers, and sextant stools, for listening to the whisperings of nature at the roof of the world. With 2 ships, the Proteus and the Neptune, and a team of 25 men, they moved northward with the patient, determined rhythm of science. Their destination was Fort Conger, a desolate wooden outpost near Ellesmere Island, where they would overwinter and gather data for the betterment of mankind. For a time, they thrived. Observations were made with diligence, auroras recorded, ice measured, and the maps of the region filled in with careful lines. They even managed to achieve a record for farthest north travel at the time. But the Arctic, gentle only in illusion, has long reminded humankind that it bends to no calendar and yields to no intention. The Proteus, meant to resupply them the following year, was crushed in the ice. The following ship, the Neptune, was turned back by heavy pack ice in 1882. The men at Fort Conger waited, hopeful at first, then concerned, and finally resigned to the truth. No ship was coming. With their food dwindling and no rescue in sight, Greely made the decision to retreat southward, hoping to reach supply caches laid along the coast of Greenland and the shores of Smith Sound. In the summer of 1883, they boarded small boats and drifted slowly southward through cracks in the melting ice, finally establishing a camp at Cape Sabine. There, they waited, again this time, not for knowledge or records, but simply for survival. Cape Sabine, windswept and barren, offered little comfort. The Arctic, in early autumn, had already begun its descent into another long and merciless winter. Their shelter was little more than a canvas tent and a makeshift hut. The men, once scientists and soldiers, now became keepers of cold minutes and silent days. They rationed their food, burned seal blubber for warmth, and kept diaries with trembling hands. The silence became deeper than the snow itself. Hunger did not come all at once. It arrived gradually, hollowing them out with days of meager meals and nights of biting wind. The caches they had counted on were either missing or buried beneath unforgiving snow. Even with desperate foraging roots lichens, scraps of old leather-edged man grew thinner, his face drawn, eyes sunk into shadow. Some whispered prayers, others scratched letters home, knowing they might never be sent. And above them, the auroras danced quietly, indifferent to their suffering. The long Arctic night is not only cold, is endless. Weeks passed without sunlight, then months, and still no ship. By spring, of the original 25 men, only a handful remained. Greeley, emaciated but still leading, held them together with quiet discipline. He forbade any disorder, kept what semblance of routine he could, and noted the deaths in his journal with heartbreaking calm. The snow outside their hut bore no footprints only. The wind moved freely. Then, finally, in June of 1884, salvation appeared on the horizon. A rescue party led by Commander Winfield Schley arrived, bringing warmth, food, and astonishment. They found 7 survivors, barely alive. Greeley was among them, thin as a ghost, yet with eyes that still held resolve. What had begun as a mission of learning had become one of endurance. Though the United States hailed Greeley a hero and awarded honors to the survivors, the true legacy of the expedition lay not in medals, but in the quiet courage of men who faced the deep cold with determination and dignity. Today, few remember the coordinates of Fort Conger or the magnetic readings they collected, but the story of Greeley's party lives on not as a tale of triumph or tragedy, but as a reflection of what it means to hold fast to hope in the loneliest places on earth. There is something profoundly human about a mail station that never received a message, about instruments packed away when hands grew too weak to lift them. There is a deep stillness in that story, like snow falling on abandoned footprints, reminding us that even in the harshest corners of the world, endurance can be quiet, and strength need not raise its voice. In the cold hush of the Arctic, long after the tents collapsed and the winds moved on, their story lingers like a soft echo in the ice, asking not to be judged, but gently remembered. Chapter 7. The Bachimo Ghost Ship, 1931, icebound and adrift forever. There are ships that sail, and there are ships that vanish, but rarer still are the ships that simply refuse to stop drifting, existing somewhere between presence and absence, held not by anchor or crew, but by the soft pull of legend and ice. In the cold, vast reaches of the Arctic Ocean, just off the windswept coast of Alaska, there once sailed such a vessel, the Bachimo, built in 1914 and passed from German to British hands after the First World War. She was no grand explorer nor storied man-o'-war, just a steel-hulled cargo ship, humble in form but destined for a fate far stranger than her makers could ever imagine. In her working years, the Bachimo traveled north each season, trading with indigenous communities along the frigid coastlines of the Northwest Territories, exchanging furs and goods in quiet harmony with a world marked by ice and wind. Her voyages were not rushed. They followed the tempo of seasons, the rhythm of melting floes and darkening skies. But in October of 1931, as winter crept southward and the land braced for its long slumber, the Bachamo became trapped in pack ice near Barrow, Alaska. Her crew, seasoned and used to Arctic stubbornness, did what they had done before, waited. When the ice refused to release her, they built a shelter nearby and hoped the ship might be freed in time. But the Bachamo had already begun her slow departure, not from place, but from certainty. On November 24th, a sudden blizzard swept over the region, and when the white quiet cleared, the ship was gone, vanished, not sunken, not missing. Believing she had broken apart beneath a strain of ice, the crew returned home, and that should have been the end. But the Bachamo had not sunk. Days later, she was seen drifting, intact, miles from where she had been imprisoned. No crew aboard, no damage visible, just her cold steel hull gliding slowly through Arctic fog, a ghost of industry moving where no path was set. She was boarded again, briefly, then left behind, deemed too risky to salvage in deepening winter. Yet the story did not end with the snow. Over the following decades, the Bachamo appeared again and again, always empty, always afloat, moving silently through mists and over ice-blown waters. In 1933, a group of Inupiat hunters saw her sliding past their camp like a steel shadow. In 1939, she was boarded by explorers who found her holds nearly untouched. As late as the 1960s, people still reported sightings, her name still legible on the hull, her decks eerily quiet beneath drifting snow. She had become more than a ship. She had become a whisper of the sea itself, a story told in low voices around Arctic fires and radio towers alike. No one ever witnessed her sink. No official wreckage was recovered. And in time, the Bachamo drifted out of record and into memory, her location a question, her journey a mystery. Some said she had found a rhythm in the Arctic's strange stillness, following unseen currents like a forgotten melody played by water and wind. Others believed she had finally surrendered to the depths, resting in silence where ice and sea keep secrets well. But even that is unknown. What remains is the softness of her legend, a ship without a crew, without a destination, gently brushing against the shores of belief. And in that quiet, she tells us something we rarely hear, that not all disappearances are losses, some are transitions. Not all ships carry men, some carry stories, and not all vessels must be steered. Some simply drift, like thoughts half remembered, or dreams not fully woken. The Bachamo, in her long, silent voyage, became less a thing of iron and rivets, and more a present spark of the sea and the sky, moving slowly through the Arctic not as wreckage, but as memory in motion. Her tale invites no alarm, only reflection, and the kind of gentle wondering that settles over the soul like snow on a quiet deck. What does it mean to vanish without vanishing? To be present, yet unreachable? In that question lies her calm power. For in every whisper of drifting steel, in every unconfirmed sighting through the frost, the Bachamo teaches us not about fear, but about patience, mystery, and the soft endurance of things not yet finished. Somewhere, perhaps, she still drifts silent, untouched and free. The Andes Flight 571, 1972, where survivors became legends, in the gentle hush of October 13, 1972, a Fairchild FH2-27D, twin-engine turboprop, lifted off from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 souls, most of them young rugby players, bound for a match in Santiago, Chile. Their laughter, light chatter, and the warmth of shared camaraderie filled the narrow cabin as the plane climbed into the South American sky. Beneath them, the vast Andes Mountains stretched like frozen waves, ancient and unmoved, whispering quiet secrets in their snow-blown ridges. Somewhere over the peaks, in a place the maps only barely dared to outline, weather turned quietly treacherous, low visibility, biting winds, and an error in navigation veered the aircraft off course. The crew, believing they had already passed the mountains, began their descent. But the mountains had not passed. With no dramatic thunder, only the subdued crunch of impact muffled by snow. The plane struck a ridge, snapping wings and tail and crumpling forward into a bank of icy silence. When all movement stopped, the sky seemed to lean in and listen. Of the 45 on board, 12 were taken by the crash, while 33 stirred amidst the wreckage, wrapped in silence and disbelief, surrounded by glacial white that mirrored a kind of stunned numbness in their minds. There was no dramatic music, no blaze of rescue sirens, just wind, just stillness. They were trapped in one of the most remote, inhospitable places on Earth. No trees, no animals, just snow, rock, and cold. So cold it erased breath mid-air. Days passed like slow-moving clouds. They rationed what little they had, wine, chocolate, a few tins of food, but the rations were for hours, not weeks. As their small supplies vanished, and as snowstorms erased all signs of the crash from passing planes above, hope did not shatter, it dissolved gently, like a mirage fading. Rescue never came. The authorities, believing no one could survive such a crash in the Andes, called off the search after just 8 days. But deep in the mountains, the survivors were still alive, cold, hungry, and slowly understanding the scale of their isolation. Weeks passed. The cold crept closer. Night temperatures fell to -30 degrees Celsius. The fuselage became their shelter. Their lifeboat buried in snow, where bodies pressed together not from affection but from desperate preservation. The line between waiting and surviving blurred. On the 17th day, an avalanche swept over their fragile camp as they slept, burying them in snow, silencing 8 more of their friends. Still, the survivors endured. Their world had shrunk to a white silence. And in that silence, the hardest decision came not as a sudden storm, but as a whispered necessity to live. They had to accept nourishment from the bodies of their departed friends. There was no drama, no frenzied desperation, only quiet consent. The decision was collective, discussed with reverence, not panic. It was a choice made not from savagery, but from the slow, thoughtful understanding that survival sometimes asks us to walk paths we never imagined. Days blended. Time had no numbers. The sun rose and fell, but the cold stayed constant. When a transistor radio crackled to life one day and announced the search had ended, it did not break them. Instead, it focused them. The only way out was through the mountains. 2 of the strongest among them, Fernando Parado and Roberto Canesso, prepared for what no one believed possible. With no maps, no gear, only fragments of insulation in their shoes and a handmade sleeping bag, they stepped into the blinding snow. 10 days they walked, scaling ridges, slipping down slopes, each footstep a whisper of defiance against the quiet indifference of the mountains. Behind them, those still at the crash site waited, not in panic, but in the stillness that had now become familiar. The 2 men finally reached help, and the world turned its gaze to the Andes once more. Helicopters flew to the crash site, where 16 survivors emerged, some unable to walk, some too thin to stand, but all wrapped in a quiet strength no words could describe. The world learned of their ordeal, the days without food, the avalanche, the choice, and though headlines screamed of cannibalism, they missed the point. This was not a story of horror. It was a story of stillness, of human endurance, nestled gently within the slow breath of the mountains. These were not wild men, they were thoughtful, articulate, even humorous, despite what they had endured. They spoke of their fallen friends, not as resources, but as sacred memory, and of survival as something quiet and humble. The mountains had taken much, but taught them something rare, that life, in its deepest form, is not about control or conquest, but about presence, about sitting with the unknown, about sharing warmth when none should exist, about enduring when the world offers nothing but silence. Over the years, many tried to dissect the story, to analyze the choices, to render judgment. But perhaps the story of Flight 571 is not meant for judgment or analysis. Perhaps it is a reminder that even in the most frozen places, where time seems to stand still and the winds whisper no answers, the human spirit, when calm, when still, can echo more strongly than any rescue flare. The Andes did not swallow these souls, they shaped them, and as they descended into history, not as victims, but as legends, their story did not disturb, it soothed. It reminded us that not all mysteries are outside of US Psalm, are within. That courage is often silent, that survival is not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope wrapped in snow, and that, sometimes, in the very coldest places on earth, something deeply warm can endure a bond, a memory, a strength so still and quiet that it becomes eternal. In the hush of those mountains, under the weight of snow and time, something timeless stirred, not a cry, not a call, but the gentle breath of humanity refusing to fade. And for those who listen, not to the noise, but to the silence, it still whispers of friendship, of choices made in reverence, of nights spent dreaming, beneath a fuselage of frost, and of footsteps in snow that became the heartbeat of a story that, even now, rests not in fear, but in wonder. The Tignes Ski Patrol, 1970, vanished beneath avalanche tracks in the stillness of the French Alps, where wind moves like slow breath across the face of snow-covered peaks, and shadows fall long between silent pine trees. There is a village, named Tignes, nestled among towering ridges that rise like sleeping giants cloaked in white. In February of 1970, the air there was clean and sharp, the kind that carries the quiet creak of distant snow settling and the low murmur of skis tracing familiar routes. The people of Tignes had always known the mountains were more than mere stone and frost. They were ancient beings, beautiful but indifferent, steady and unmoved by human time. Skiing was not just a sport in this place, but a rhythm of life. And among the villagers were those who had grown up with snow in their lungs and wind in their ears, who could read the mood of a slope the way a sailor reads the sea. These were the Ski Patrol, a group of trained locals whose duty it was to monitor the alpine trails, prevent accidents, and most of all watch for avalanches, the great white sighs of the mountain that, without warning, could sweep away all sound and shape into frozen stillness. On that February day, with skies grey and low and fresh powder blanketing the slopes, 5 members of the Tignes Ski Patrol set out early in the morning. Their mission was routine: to test snowpack integrity along a ridge known for its quiet instability, and to assess risk for the influx of visiting skiers expected that weekend. with radios clipped to their jackets and their sledges trailing behind. They moved with practiced ease up the trail, disappearing into the pale wash of mist that had settled between peaks. There was no distress call, no break in the calm, no tremor beneath the snow, only their steady tracks leading into the whiteness. But when the sun broke briefly through the clouds around midday and the patrol base tried to make contact, there was nothing. Hours passed, evening crept in. The radio remained silent. Another team was dispatched, their movements cautious, each step placed with care as they followed the faint impressions left by the first crew. But the path abruptly ended in a field of disturbed snow abroad, silent wound in the mountainside where an avalanche had slipped like a whisper. It was not violent, not dramatic, but subtle and suffocating. Searchers dug and called. They listened. And for 2 days, they found only fragments, one broken ski, a pair of gloves, 2 sledges twisted and left like questions. No bodies, no equipment, no sign of panic. The snow had taken them gently, as if absorbing them into itself. When rescue teams arrived from nearby regions, they combed the slopes with trained dogs and probes, carefully etching new lines through the powder. Still, nothing. It was as if the mountain had decided to unwrite them. In time, people speculated. Had they triggered the avalanche themselves? Had they seen it coming and tried to warn others? Or had something more unusual happened, unpredictable shearing of snow layers beneath their feet, collapsing without noise, sucking them into a crevasse or snow cave that closed immediately behind? These questions settled over the village. Like frost, locals spoke of the men's experience, their caution, their deep familiarity with the land. These were not strangers to risk, they were born of this place. And yet, the mountain gave no explanation. The search eventually ceased. Fresh snow fell, trails were regroomed, the season continued, and the memory of the vanished patrol passed into the quiet stories told by fireplace light and over mugs of warming drink, becoming part of the landscape's deeper history. In later years, a few more items were recovered near the avalanche site. Personal effects, a ski pole, a torn piece of red jacket. But the men themselves, and the moment they disappeared, remained hidden beneath meters of layered time. Geologists would later say that the snowpack that year had unusual stratification, fine lines of compressed ice and buried warmth that may have created instability invisible to the eye. But even they admitted this alone could not fully explain the absence not just of the men, but of all signs of their struggle. If they had been swept, where were their forms? If they had fallen into a fissure, why no echo, no surface disturbance? The mountain answered nothing, and so the story became not one of fear, but of quiet reverence, a reminder that even today, in a world mapped by satellites and crossed by signal, there are places that remain untouched by certainty. The Tignes patrol were not victims, nor cautionary tales. They were, and remain, part of a mystery that speaks softly and only to those who know how to listen. Hikers who pass the old trail sometimes pause at a certain bend where wind gathers strangely, where snow hangs heavy on boughs even in spring. Some say it feels different there, not ominous, but still as if something continues to watch or wait. Perhaps it is only imagination. Or perhaps, in places where nature still holds all the time in the world, what disappears does not vanish, simply waits beneath the snow, becoming part of the rhythm. Like footsteps in fresh powder, stories of the Tignes ski patrol fade each season only to be retold anew by those who understand that mystery is not absence, is presence we don't yet understand. And in that presence, in that soft silence where answers are not demanded, we find a kind of peace. For not every path is meant to be traced back. Not every loss is meant to be restored. Some are meant simply to be remembered. And when the wind moves again across those ridges, and the snow glows faintly under the moon, their names are carried not in sound but in stillness. Chapter 10. The Icelandic Hikers of Vatnajökull. 1979. Swallowed by a glacier lake in the vast and softly breathing landscape of Iceland, where fire sleeps beneath frost and ancient glaciers cradle the secrets of time, lies the sprawling white world of Vatnajökull's largest ice cap, a place so silent and expansive it feels almost untouched by the present. In the summer of 1979, when the days were long and the light hung golden over moss-covered lava fields, a young Icelandic couple set out for a hiking journey into the southern reaches of the glacier. They were newly married, both in their 20s. Full of warmth and plans, their backpacks packed neatly with rations, maps, and handwritten notes. Their names were not the kind that history books remember, but those who knew them said they were gentle spirits, lovers of nature, and respectful of the elements. It wasn't uncommon for locals and tourists alike to trek near the glacier's edge, marveling at the shifting blues of its ancient ice and the distant rumble of carving. But this couple planned something slightly different, a circular route that would take them to the edge of a lesser-known glacial lake forming from the slow melt of Vatnajökull's southeastern corner. They checked in with rangers, waved to fellow hikers at the trailhead, and then stepped into the high silence of the glacier's domain, where wind whispers across ridges, and the only sound is the soft crunch of boots against old snow. The days passed. The couple didn't return. At first, there was no great alarm. Delays were not unusual in the wilderness, and hikers often adjusted plans due to weather or wonder. But when a full day passed with no sign, search efforts began. A small team of rangers followed the notes left in the station, pinpointing their likely trail. It was a path bordered by black volcanic sand and pale glacial runoff, a quiet, surreal corridor between earth and ice. What they found chilled them more than the cold wind ever could. Just at the base of a ridge, where the land sloped gently down toward a milky blue glacial lake, the searchers found footprints, two sets, walking side by side, calm and undisturbed. The prints moved all the way to the very edge of the lake, and then nothing. No return path, no signs of struggle, just the glassy surface of the water and the gentle hiss of meltwater trickling nearby. Their packs were not found. No clothing, no gear, only the tracks, preserved in the damp sediment like quiet signatures. The lake itself, formed from decades of slow thaw, was deceptive. What looked like a placid pool was, in fact, a glacial tongue beneath, with unpredictable currents and hidden shafts beneath thin layers of ice. Rescue divers attempted to search the lake, but visibility was near zero, and the floor dropped off sharply only a few feet from shore. Equipment malfunctioned in the freezing water. Even sonar offered only vague contours, deep hollows, shifting silt and cold that made metal groan. Days turned to weeks. The couple's names were etched into local notice boards, and their families held hope in silence. But as time passed, the story faded from the headlines and settled into something else, an echo among the locals. A soft cautionary tale told in quiet tones by hikers watching the ice from a distance. Scientists later speculated that the lake, warmed slightly by geothermal vents, may have weakened the ice crust along the shore, allowing the hikers to fall silently through. But the fact that both would vanish so cleanly, leaving not even a floating scarf or glint of metal, puzzled everyone. Some said perhaps the couple had walked into the lake intentionally drawn by something. A poetic final act, but those who knew them dismissed this idea gently and firmly. They had been happy, planning their future, making grocery lists and dog-eared guidebooks. Others suggested a sudden shift in the glacier beneath, a small seismic murmur that pulled the edge inward, creating a silent collapse that swallowed all. In a blink, but no such quake was recorded, no tremor felt, no noise carried through the crisp air, just absence. And so the Vatanical honeymooners became part of the glacier's story, a story not of fear, but of stillness. Their disappearance was not marked by panic or tragedy in the traditional sense, but by a kind of serene unknowability. As the glacier continues to retreat in our warming world, some believe the lake may someday drain, revealing the truth beneath. But for now, it holds them in its heart, undisturbed, unnamed. Tour guides rarely mention the tale outright, though some, when standing with small groups on high trails overlooking the shimmering ice, might pause, let silence fall, and then gesture toward the lake with a vague reverence. It is not fear that fills the pause, it's something quieter, a respect for mystery, for the way that time sometimes chooses to hide, not destroy. Perhaps the couple are not gone, but simply kept trapped in a moment that the glacier decided to keep for itself. In this way, they belong not just to Iceland, but to the deeper rhythm of the earth, where wind and water meet and where questions are not answered with certainty, but with awe. Their story invites us not to solve, but to pause to see footprints leading to still water and to feel something unspoken stir in the chest. Because some paths, once walked, vanish behind the walker, and some stories are meant not to be explained, but remembered softly, like fog rising from a glacial lake in the early light, revealing nothing, and yet everything. Chapter 11. The B-52 Thule Crash. 1968. Nuclear Secrets on Greenland Ice. In the unyielding vastness of Greenland's northern ice, where winds speak in whispers across ancient snowfields, and the horizon blurs between frozen earth and silver. Sky, one of the Cold War's quietest yet most unsettling incidents, unfolded in silence. It was January 21st, 1968, a time when the world's great powers watched each other across oceans and continents, and the sky itself became a stage for unseen maneuvers. That day, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber, part of a Vent Secret Airborne Alert mission known as Operation Chrome Dome, patrolled near the Arctic. Armed not only with its 8 engines and military technology, but with 4 hydrogen bombs on board. The aircraft had flown from Plattsburgh Air Force Base in New York, part of a continuous airborne deterrent strategy that saw bombers circling key routes 24 hours a day, just in case the unimaginable occurred. But the unimaginable came not in the form of conflict, but of failure. Somewhere over Baffin Bay, just west of Greenland, the cabin of the B-52 began to fill with smoke. A fire, later traced to a fault in an electrical system near the navigator's seat, began to spread rapidly, and with the Arctic cold pressing in from outside, the crew made the decision to abandon the aircraft. 7 of the crew ejected into the frigid January air. 6 would survive, found shivering in the snow by Danish and American search teams. 1 did not, and the plane, still carrying its cargo of nuclear weapons, crashed onto the sea ice near Thule Air Base. The explosion lit up the icy night with an otherworldly fireball, shattering the silence of the frozen world and scattering debris along with radioactive material across several miles of Arctic tundra. For days, and then weeks, recovery teams worked under a blanket of silence and snow, attempting to retrieve not only the shattered remains of the bomber, but the broken fragments of its 4 thermonuclear warheads. 3 of the 4 bombs were confirmed found, though they had disintegrated into hundreds of pieces. But the fourth raised questions. No full device was recovered. Rumors began to swirl. Was it buried deep in the ice, sealed away like an ancient relic beneath compacted snow? Or had it fallen through the thinning sea ice into the black Arctic water below? Official reports maintained that all components were accounted for, but whispers among those involved in the cleanup suggested otherwise. The operation codename Crested Ice became one of the most secretive and logistically challenging recoveries in American military history, with over 700 personnel deployed to sift through thousands of tons of ice and wreckage under sub-zero temperatures. Decontamination became an endless task, with radioactive snow and debris hauled away in steel containers, some bound for storage deep within the United States. But while machinery and tools were retrieved, parts of the crew were not. Several airmen were accounted for by the ejection and rescue logs. Others remained unnamed, their presence on the flight suspected but not confirmed. Some claimed these were intelligence officers or nuclear specialists flying unofficially. Others believed they had perished and simply become lost beneath the ice, never formally logged, never officially mourned. And then there were the Danish workers, local Thule Inuit and contractors, many of whom fell ill in the years following the cleanup. The United States government would later settle with dozens of them, not openly admitting fault but acknowledging that exposure may have occurred. Still, among the community in northwest Greenland, the crash became more than an incident, became a scar on the ice, one that could not be seen but never quite forgotten. Stories emerged in hushed tones, of strange discoloration on the snow that would not melt, of machinery that stopped working without cause, of searchers who wandered too far from camp and returned, changed, not harmed, not injured, but quieter, more distant, as if they had seen something they could not place into words. The crash site, now covered by shifting snowdrifts and glacial movement, remains largely inaccessible. Modern satellite imagery shows only the smooth whiteness of the polar cap, as if nothing had ever happened there. But those who know, who live near Thule or served on the base, remembered the silence that followed. The skies were no longer filled with the distant hum of patrols. Operation Chrome Dome was suspended just days later, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that some risks were simply too great, even during the long tension of the Cold War, and beneath that silence, questions remained, not of war, but of presence. What had fallen from the sky that night? A machine, yes, but also an idea that even the most advanced, most controlled systems could falter, and that the Earth, ancient and indifferent, would take what fell and keep it. Today, there are still those who believe the missing pieces of that 4th bomb rest beneath the ice, slowly descending deeper each year as snow accumulates and seasons shift. Some geologists have argued that, by now, the wreckage may lie hundreds of feet below the surface, entombed in glacial layers that won't see light again for centuries. Others believe that the missing components were never truly lost, but quietly removed by elite recovery teams and hidden from public knowledge. The truth, like so much buried in Arctic silence, remains elusive. And so the Thule B-52 crash becomes not just an event, but a question, one that lingers like vapor in the colder mystery, wrapped not in legend, but in classified files, melted snow, and missing names. It is not a story of terror, nor a tale of heroes and villains. It is a soft echo through frozen air, asking what we truly understand about the things we send into the sky, and how thin the line is between control and surrender. The Greenland ice remembers. The wind that drifts over it today still passes. Over that same stretch of land where fire once met frost, and a moment in time was sealed away beneath a blanket of snow. Whether we choose to open that blanket someday or let it remain, untouched and unspoken, may depend not on our need for answers, but on our comfort with unknowing. For there is a kind of peace, perhaps, in mysteries that do not cry out to be solved, but that simply remain, resting beneath the ice, waiting for no one. Chapter 12. C. The Iceman. 1991. Copper Age body lost to glacial melt in the quiet stillness of the Alps. High in the Etzdal Mountains along the border between Austria and Italy, where the winds move gently over glacial fields and time seems to freeze in more ways than one. An ancient man lay hidden beneath layers of snow and silence for over 5,000 years, undisturbed by the civilizations that rose and fell beneath him. In 1991, two hikers, simply wandering through the mountains near the Dyatlov Pass, stumbled upon what they believed to be the remains of a recent climber body partially exposed in the melting glacial ice. But as experts arrived and began to brush back the snow and examine the figure more closely, they realized they were not looking at a modern accident, but a preserved soul from another age entirely. What they had found would come to be known as C.I., the Iceman, named after the mountains where he was found, one of the oldest naturally mummified human bodies ever discovered. The glaciers had kept him sealed in a kind of cold stillness, preserving not only his skin and bones, but his clothing, tools, and even the remnants of his last meal. His presence offered a rare and silent window into the Copper Age, a time often spoken of in generalities and fragments, but never before seen with such quiet intimacy. C. was a man of about 45 years already, elderly by the standards of his time, and his face, though weathered, still carried the softness of rest. His eyes, sunken yet gentle, had not seen daylight in over 50 centuries, yet now looked once more toward the sky. The artifacts found with him told a story not with words, but with simple materials: a finely stitched cloak made from woven grass fibers, a coat and leggings crafted from goat and deer hide, shoes padded with hay for insulation, and a fur hat tied carefully beneath his chin. He carried with him a copper axe with a yew wood handler tool, so well made and advanced for its time that it seemed almost out of place, and a longbow, unfinished but carefully carved, along with a quiver of arrows, some already others waiting for completion. There were tools of stone and bone, a backpack frame, a tinder pouch filled with fungus and flint, and even a kind of primitive medicine kit containing birch polypore mushrooms, known now to have antibacterial properties. Each object, quietly resting beside him, seemed to whisper of daily life in a time before written memory. C's body itself was a record written in flesh and bone. Over 60 tattoos marked his skin patterns of lines and crosses inked with soot, often along joints and the spine. These were not decorative, researchers believe, but therapeutic, a kind of early acupuncture perhaps, meant to ease the pain of worn knees and a stiff back. His stomach held traces of einkorn wheat, wild goat meat, and fern, suggesting not only his final meal, but the last few places he had walked. the altitude he had traversed, and even the season of his death. Science, in its quiet and careful way, has told us that he died in late spring or early summer, possibly caught in a sudden storm or fleeing some unknown pursuit, as an arrowhead was found lodged deep in his shoulder, and wounds on his hands hinted at a recent struggle. Yet the mountain held him not as a victim, but as a witness preserving his story, not in tragedy, but in stillness. The ice that had once hidden him began to retreat with climate change, and so CA returned to us, not because he was sought, but because the earth itself shifted just enough to reveal him. And in doing so, the glaciers offered something they so rarely give, a moment of quiet communion across millennia. Unlike grand monuments or golden relics, CZ's legacy is not one of power or wealth, but of the ordinary made sacred by time. A man walking the high paths, dressed for cold, carrying tools shaped by hand and need, facing the elements alone and then becoming one with them. His discovery stirred the scientific world. Yes, but more than that, it stirred the imagination. Who was he? Where was he going? Was he fleeing something or simply crossing the peaks? Was he a hunter, a herder, a healer? No scroll or tablet can tell us. Only the hush of his presence remains. The debate surrounding his cause of death, his origins, even the purpose of his tattoos or the metallurgy of his axe, all orbit around one fixed truth: he was real, a person, a traveler like so many before and after, whose life was not meant to be remembered, but now is because the mountain kept him. In museums now, where his body rests in a carefully maintained environment, mirroring the glacial cold, visitors peer through glass not at a relic, but at something quietly human. The wrinkles of his lips, the creases around his eyes, the way his hand curled around nothing, these are not the signs of a symbol, but of a life. And in that recognition, in that breath of shared humanity across 50 centuries, there is something profoundly stilling. C asks nothing of us, and yet he gives a reminder that beneath our histories, technologies, and noise, there is always the walk, the climb, the shelter found against wind, that our lives are sewn together not by grand stories, but by the quiet repetitions of days, meals, tools, and paths, and that sometimes it is not the kings or conquerors who endure, but the wanderer, the common soul, embraced by snow and carried forward by ice. As the world continues to warm, and more secrets once held in glaciers begin to emerge, Sues, arrows, bodies from forgotten times, C remains not just a singular find, but perhaps a herald of what is to come. His presence, once isolated, now stands among many questions. What else lies beneath the retreating ice? What other voices may rise, not in sound, but in presence? We do not know. But as long as we remember to listen, not just with our instruments, but with quiet reverence, then these ancient lives may continue to speak in stillness, in silence, and in the slow, careful language of time. Siberian mammoth hunters, 1948, Stone Age hunters frozen in time, in the far-reaching stillness of Siberia's frozen plains, where the sky stretches endlessly across a land that holds memory in its silence. A discovery in 1948 opened a quiet door to a forgotten chapter of human history, as seen, not imagined, but carefully preserved in frost, where time had not erased, only paused. It began in the remote region of Yakutia, within the Lena River basin, a place of tundra winds and ancient stillness, where permafrost grips the earth with such patience that even the past itself seems reluctant to move. Soviet geologists, searching for signs of mineral wealth beneath the cold ground, came instead upon something far older, far more delicate, a grouping of bones, not scattered or jumbled as one might expect, but arranged with the gentle order of purpose. There lay the remains of several woolly mammoths, massive creatures of the Ice Age, their tusks curved like frozen rivers, their skeletons intact and resting as if sleep had simply overtaken them. But it was not the mammoths alone that drew the attention of the scientists. Nearby, carefully placed stone tools were found, sharpened blades, bone awls, and spear points that had not been scattered by erosion or time, but left as if in use only days before. And there, beside the mammoths, the quiet shadows of their hunters, human remains, aged more than 12,000 years, preserved in permafrost so perfectly that hair, skin, and sinew still whispered of life. These were not just bones, but people, Stone Age hunters who had lived and moved and labored under the very same sky, whose last moments were now etched into the ice in silence. Their tools were made from the flint of riverbeds, shaped with a patience that could only come from deep knowledge and repetition, their purpose unmistakable, to bring down giants. And yet, these hunters had not died in chaos or battle. They had died near their quarry, their hands near the tools of their work, and the mammoths had not been stripped or harvested. This scene, this frozen moment, seemed almost ritualistic, as if something had interrupted the rhythm of life in a single instant, preserving not just death, but presence. Scholars would come to study the site with reverence, measuring not only the artifacts, but the positioning of each item and each body, piecing together a story that could not be spoken. The mammoths had been encircled with stones, the kind used to weigh down hides or perhaps mark territory, and the remains of cooking fires, long since extinguished, left behind blackened impressions in the soil. These clues told a story of preparation, of planning, of ancient intelligence, an echo of community that stretched back across the long glacier of time. And yet, the reason for this perfect preservation, this sudden end, remains unknown. Perhaps a sudden thaw refroze before the hunters could finish their task. Perhaps an avalanche swept through the site without disturbing the natural arrangement. Or perhaps, as some quietly believe, the hunters and their prey succumbed to the same quiet force of nature together. What the scene offers is not certainty, but quiet reflection, a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the world, human lives unfolded with richness and ritual, with effort and understanding. These people were not primitive shadows, but thinkers, builders, cooperators, who understood the world not through books, but through watching the wind, reading the snow, listening to the breath of herds and the cracking of ice. They lived with the earth, not above it, and the tools they left behind speak not of violence, but of balance. Even the mammoths, now extinct, are remembered not here as hunted beasts, but as neighbors in the great circle of life, caught together in a moment that has endured longer than empires. As the permafrost slowly thaws with the warming of the world, more such discoveries may emerge, dramatic or terrifying, but deeply human. A child's footprint beside a fire, a basket half woven, a hunter's last meal wrapped in leaves. These quiet revelations offer not answers, but reminders that we come from people who walked with purpose, who shaped the world not with noise, but with careful rhythm, who looked at the cold horizon not with despair, but with knowledge. And as their images are unearthed, it is not their deaths that speak, but their lives. In the modern world, filled with information and speed, it can be easy to forget how much can be held in stillness. These ancient Siberian hunters, wrapped in fur and guided by starlight, did not leave behind monuments or books, but they left something perhaps more lasting, a glimpse of harmony with the land, of cycles understood and accepted, of skill passed from hand to hand. They remind us that history is not only found in ruins and scrolls, but in the quiet places, the frozen corners where time folds inward and preserves not just bone, but story. The tools left behind at the site, when placed beside their makers, form a kind of silent language, one that tells of adaptation and wisdom. The curvature of a scraper, the smoothing of a handle, the wear on a stone ore offer testimony of labor, of practice, of repetition that led to survival. And more than that, they suggest care, not just in crafting, but in life itself. The arrangement of the bodies suggests perhaps a family or a hunting band that traveled together, worked together, and faced the elements side by side, that they now rest together thousands of years later is not tragedy, it is continuity. The site has been studied for decades, with advances in archaeology and climatology offering new insights into the past. Radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, and ancient DNA sequencing have illuminated details once thought lost. Yet even with all this knowledge, the feeling that comes from standing, if only in imagination, at the edge of that snowy field remains unchanged. It is a sense of reverence, of stillness, of shared existence. For though we may now travel with satellites and sensors, there remains something deeply grounding in the realization that once, long ago, people walked this earth with nothing but stone and fire, and did so with grace. The mammoths themselves, majestic and powerful, now known through fossils and reconstructions, are given a final dignity here, not in the museums where their bones are displayed, but in this field, beside the hunters who understood them best. It was not dominance, but respect that defined that relationship. And perhaps it is that quiet respect, that recognition of shared life in a cold world, that the ice chose to preserve. Today, the site is rarely visited, difficult to access, and slowly changing with the climate. But its lessons do not fade. They echo gently across time, inviting us not to conquer the past, but to listen. Not to rush toward conclusions, but to rest in questions. To imagine not what we can extract from history, but what it can teach us about being present, about living with care, about walking lightly. For those hunters whose names we do not know, whose voices we cannot hear, did not ask to be remembered. And yet, in their stillness, they remain, not frozen in fear or accident, but simply here, resting in the frost, waiting for the snow to melt. And in that waiting, they remind us that the deepest stories are often the quietest, the ones that don't demand to be told, but are content to be felt beneath the surface of words, beneath the surface of time. North Pole for Station, 1970. Researchers who evaporated in blizzards, in the vast wind-shaped emptiness of Earth's northernmost reaches, where the sun dips low for months and the cold itself seems to hum with ancient memory. A small group of researchers once lived suspended between ice and sky, aboard a drifting station known as North Pole 4, established by the Soviet Union in 1970. North Pole 4 was one of several polar drift stations designed to follow the slow, unpredictable movements of pack ice across the Arctic Ocean, quietly gathering meteorological, geophysical, and oceanographic data. These stations, part science, part survival experiment, were constructed on naturally occurring ice floes, temporary platforms that shifted with the currents, creaked under pressure ridges, and fractured without warning. Life on such stations was a quiet endurance of routine and cold. Researchers lived in insulated cabins, surrounded by the endless whiteness of sea ice. The only color often the faded red of a flag or the soft green of their uniforms. The world beyond their walls was flat and endless, save for the occasional polar bear or faint shimmer of auroras. On North Pole 4, a handful of men performed their tasks diligently, launching weather balloons into the sky, drilling holes through thick ice for ocean samples, noting cloud cover and wind speeds in leather-bound logs. Radio contact linked them to the mainland, but only faintly waves bouncing and bending through atmospheric noise. And then, in a season of deep silence and drifting fog, something changed. A routine transmission went unanswered, then another and another. When attempts to re-establish contact failed, Soviet authorities quietly initiated a rescue effort. But the Arctic does not rush. Helicopters struggled to find their way through unpredictable cloud banks and shifting winds. And when they finally located the coordinates where North Pole 4 was last reported, what they found was not catastrophe, but absence. The station, once so precisely arranged with scientific discipline, was scattered. Pieces of equipment, tan, overturned chair, a weather balloon rig, a half-frozen parka were strewn about like forgotten tools. A sled lay tipped on its side, its runners still marked by wind-blown snow. The radio tower had collapsed, but not from violence. It had simply leaned into the drift and given way. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. Only the wind and the whiteness. The search team, themselves trained in the quiet dangers of polar research, spent days scouring the surrounding floes. Had the ice cracked beneath them? Had a blizzard confused and scattered them? Had they ventured too far from shelter, hoping to retrieve something blown loose by the wind? The possibilities whispered around the rescue team, but none ever shouted a clear answer. It was as if the cold itself had erased them, not in malice, but in its usual, indifferent hush. Over time, theories emerged. One posited that an unnoticed fissure beneath the station had widened during the night, swallowing tents and researchers in a single, silent shift. Another suggested a whiteout, the kind where horizon and ground become one, might have disoriented even the most experienced men, leading them unknowingly into the blankness. A more technical explanation suggested that the ice floe itself may have fractured so slowly and cleanly that the station was divided in two. The men separated from their communication equipment without ever realizing the full danger until it was too late. But none of these theories came with evidence. And perhaps that is why the story of North Pole 4 lingers, not because of horror or spectacle, but because of its soft impossibility. Here was a place meant for observation, for data, and daily recordings, a station full of charts, graphs, radios, and journals, with trained men performing calm tasks in calm isolation, and then nothing, just missing entries in a logbook. An unfinished sentence, a last signal. The Arctic, after all, is a place where the line between presence and absence is always thin. Snowfall can cover a lifetime in minutes. Wind can carry away the trace of footsteps, and time moves slowly enough that even recent events feel ancient. The disappearance of the North Pole 4 crew was never officially declared a mystery. The Soviet program moved forward. New stations were launched. Papers were filed and shelved. But among the tight-knit community of polar researchers, the silence lingered. Some, years later, would pass through similar coordinates and think of those who had been there before. A tent flapping in the wind might stir a memory. A half-buried cable might remind one of a line once cut. And in those quiet thoughts, the men of North Pole 4 were remembered not as victims, but as part of the Arctic itself. Their work had been steady, their lives methodical. Their loss, like so much in the far north, had come not with thunder but with the stillness of drifting ice. If one could imagine standing there now, an ice floe beneath a low sun, the sky pale with cirrus trails and the air humming with cold, one might feel that absence still, not emptiness, but a kind of presence folded inward, held close by. Snow and silence. A camp once stood there. Men once laughed, argued, recorded wind speed, warmed their hands by portable heaters. They looked out at the same white world and perhaps felt what we feel now, small, awed, uncertain, not afraid but humbled. And then the ice closed over their story, and the wind moved on. That is the way of the Arctic. It keeps what it keeps, and releases only fragments. A glove, a note, a flicker of signal on an old frequency. And yet, in that quiet, in that unknowability, there is peace. Not all stories are meant to be solved. Some are meant to drift like snowflakes, like echoes. Us, that even in a world of sensors and satellites, mystery remains. And perhaps it is good that it does. For in that mystery lies a reminder that there are places still too vast to master, too cold to control, too beautiful to explain. The Arctic does not yield its secrets easily. It holds them close, beneath layers of ice and time. And so we remember North Pole 4, not with finality, but with wonder. A drifting station, a team of thoughtful explorers, a silence that endures them, a sky still listening, still waiting, still whispering their names across the snow. Norse, Greenland, 15th century colonists who faded into ice in the remote and glacial reaches of Greenland's southern coastline, where the land rises and falls in gentle stone ridges, and the ocean's breath is slow and cold. A quiet story. Once unfolded a story of hope, of endurance, and of a gentle fading that still echoes through the frost. It begins around the year 985, when Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, sailed west across the North Atlantic and found a place he called Greenland, a name chosen, perhaps, more for promise than for accuracy. And for a time, the promise held. 2 main settlements were established, the eastern settlement, near modern-day Keketok, and the western settlement, further north. The Norse who came brought with them cattle, sheep, and goats, along with iron tools, wooden furniture, and the quiet knowledge of how to build turf homes with thick walls and gently sloping roofs. Life was not easy, but it was steady. They raised livestock, harvested hay, traded with passing ships, and built churches of stone whose ruins still stand in the hush of the modern landscape. The Greenland Norse descended from Icelandic farmers, and Norwegians before them, formed a culture both familiar and remote, a Christian society shaped by European ideas, but softened and reshaped by the land itself. Their homes clustered near fjords, where summers were brief but green, and winters long and silent. They wore woolen cloaks and carved runes, wrote letters and kept accounts, baptized children and married in chapels whose bells may have once rung across the sea ice. For nearly 500 years they endured. But then, slowly and without drama, they disappeared. It did not happen all at once. The western settlement, smaller and more vulnerable, was gone by the mid-1300s. The eastern settlement lasted longer, perhaps into the early 1400s, but by the time Danish explorers returned centuries later, the farms were empty. The churches were quiet, and the people were gone. There were no mass graves, no signs of conflict, only abandonment. And so began one of history's gentlest mysteries. How could a society vanish so softly that it left no cries, only silence? Scholars have sought answers, sifting through soil, examining bones, reading the weather written in layers of ice. And what they find paints not a tragedy, but a gradual unwinding. The climate shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, as the little ice age took hold. Winters grew longer, summers shorter, hay yields diminished. The sea ice, once a highway for trade and travel, thickened and lingered, sealing off. Ships from Norway and Iceland. Isolation grew, not with walls but with waiting. Timber became scarce. Iron grew harder to obtain. Contact with Europe faded to silence. And still they endured. Archaeological digs revealed that they adapted where they could replace in wood with stone, relying more on marine resources like seals. But these adaptations came late. The Greenland Norse were farmers first. Their cultural memory, their skills, their rhythms, all rooted in grazing and harvest. As the climate turned and drift ice blocked the fjords, their world narrowed. Religious devotion remained strong, evidenced by the well-preserved churches and burial sites. But even faith, it seems, could not stave off the slow encroachment of scarcity. One theory suggests that rather than perish, many may have left sailing away in small numbers to Iceland or mainland Europe. Their stories blending into new communities, undocumented but not unimaginable. Another theory wonders if they remained until the end, daging, dwindling, enduring until the last light in the last longhouse quietly went out. What remains today is quiet testimony. The ruins of Hvelsey Church, where the last known written record of the Norse Greenlanders tells of a wedding in 1408, still stands, its stones weathered but strong, watching the fjord as it always has. Nearby lie the foundations of farmstone, outlines of buildings once warm with voices, now held only by moss and wind. Middens reveal diets shifting from cattle to seal, a slow pivot from land to sea. Skeletal remains show signs of hardship, but not violence. There is no evidence of invasion, no signs of sudden destruction, just a slow fading into frost. Some have speculated that the Inuit presence, rising during the same period, played a role, but the archaeological record suggests little evidence of conflict. In fact, it's more likely that the Norse and Inuit remained distant neighbors, separated, more by lifestyle than by animosity. The Norse clung to European ways, even as conditions worsened. Their churches grew more elaborate, not less, suggesting that their answer to hardship was not reinvention, but devotion. This cultural steadfastness, noble, but perhaps inflexible, may have contributed to their decline. They did not become the land. They tried to hold it in familiar shapes, and the land, in time, moved beyond them. Today, Greenland's southern coast is still dotted with their legacy. Visitors who walk through the ruins of the eastern settlement report a stillness that feels deeper than silencer, kind of respectful hush, as if the stones themselves remember. There are no ghosts in the frightening sense, only echoes, a footprint, pressed into turf, a doorway that once framed a family, a path that once led to a field, now swallowed by grass. The Norse Greenlanders did not leave behind epic tales or dramatic endings. They left behind something quieter, a record of resilience, of cultural memory, and of the limits of human will against a changing world. Their story is not of collapse, but of conclusion, A chapter that ended not in fire, but in frost, and in that there is beauty. For theirs was a world shaped by both belief and landscape, a world where the bell of Hvelsea may have once rung across snow-covered hills, calling the faithful to prayer, while seals moved silently beneath the ice. World of wool and stone, of fjords and faith, of stubbornness and grace. And though their voices have long since faded, their presence remains set into the earth, resting beneath the lichens, waiting not to be rescued or mourned, but remembered. As the Arctic warms once more, and the past begins to rise from the ground, we may find more traces of their lives. A bead, a comb, a child's game carved into rock. And when we do, we may be reminded not of their disappearance, but of their dignity. That for centuries they lived here not with ease, but with intention, not with abundance, but with care, and that, in the end, they did not fight the ice. They simply walked into it, quietly, together, as the sky turned pale above them and the wind began to sing a softer song. Thule, culture, abandonment. 13th century Arctic hunters disappear in the farthest reaches of the North American Arctic, where the sky hangs low and luminous, and the land stretches in silence between frozen oceans and windswept tundra. There once thrived a people whose lives were written in snow, ice, and the breath of whales. The Thule ancestors of today's Inuit emerged around 1000 AD in what is now Alaska, and over the next few centuries, they spread eastward across the top of the world from the Chukchi Sea to Greenland, leaving behind a soft trail of stone, houses, carved harpoon heads, and quiet traditions that once echoed through the still air of the high Arctic. They were masters of sea ice and migratory routes, skilled at navigating not only open waters, but the subtle movements of animal herds and shifting seasons. The Thule brought with them innovations that transformed Arctic life. The umiak, a large skin boat for transporting families and goods. The kayak, sleek and agile for hunting on open water. The dog sled, gliding like memory across packed snow. And finely tuned tools of bone and ivory, shaped by steady hands that knew the language of the cold. Their homes were dug into the earth, roofed with whalebone and sod, insulated by snow and sealed by silence, forming warm domes against the biting wind. Inside, lamps burned with seal oil, casting long shadows that flickered like old stories against curved walls. These were people not separated from their landscape, but shaped by it, woven into its rhythms so deeply that their absence later would feel like a thread gently pulled from a greater design. Around the 13th and 14th centuries, however, something began to change across regions of northern Canada, Greenland, and parts of Alaska. Entire Thule settlements were abandoned stone houses left behind with utensils still tucked into corners, bones of feasts still scattered in middens, and silence returned to places once warmed by breath and laughter. This departure, so widespread and gradual, has puzzled archaeologists and historians alike, because it did not bear the signs of violence or sudden tragedy. Instead, it seems the Thule faded from certain regions, much as they had once arrived, in a rush, but in a slow and purposeful dispersal. Several theories attempt to understand why. One turns to the climate. Around this time, the Little Ice Age began to settle over the northern hemisphere, ushering in longer winters, harsher storms, and shorter summers. In regions already perched at the edge of habitability, even small changes in temperature could tip the balance. Sea ice thickened and stayed longer into the season. Open waters, Once teeming with bowhead whales, the keystone of Thule life froze over or shifted routes. These whales, once hunted in organized groups with strong social bonds and deeply ritualized methods, began to disappear from accessible waters, and with them, a foundation of both nourishment and culture. The Thule, with their complex seasonal rounds and interdependent coastal networks, may have found that their careful equations of survival no longer added up. As food grew scarcer and travel more dangerous, families may have chosen to move, not in desperation, but with deliberate wisdom seeking new coasts, closer waters, or joining groups to the south with more reliable hunting. Another theory suggests cultural transformation rather than disappearance. In this view, the Thule did not vanish, but rather slowly became the Inuit of later centuries, adapting language, tools, and social systems in response to the changing environment. It's possible that what we see as abandonment is not the end of a culture, but a reshaping. A shift in subsistence strategies from large whale hunts to smaller seal and caribou pursuits. A turn inward from large coastal villages to smaller, more flexible inland groups. The Thule might not have disappeared. They might have merely grown quieter in the archaeological record. Their presence still felt in the continuity of traditions, beliefs, and lifeways that stretch unbroken into today's Inuit communities. Yet there's something poetic in the way their homes remain of old depressions in the tundra, still framed by ancient stones, where once a hunter's breath rose in rhythm with the fire. Whale ribs still arch like guardians over the earth, embedded in frozen ground that resists even time's soft erosion. There are places where the seal oil lamps lie blackened but intact, as if only recently extinguished. Places where snow drifts quietly into once roofed rooms, blanketing the echoes of lullabies and whispered planning. These spaces do not feel abandoned, they feel paused, as if the people might return any moment from a hunt beyond the ridge. In some locations, carved figures remain teeny ivory amulets shaped like animals or spirits, worn smooth by touch, as if meant to be held during long nights when wind sings around the eaves, and darkness folds like a blanket over the world. In others, delicate bone tools are buried beneath peat, their edges still sharp, their purpose still clear. The Thule left no grand monuments, no written language, no proclamations, but they left behind a living legacy in the very rhythm of Arctic life, a way of being that honored animals not as commodities, but as partners. A worldview that read the stars, the snow, and the silence as deeply as we read books today. The echoes of this perspective can still be found in Inuit stories, in songs passed down, and in the deep respect for balance between humans and the land. To imagine the Thule is not to imagine an extinct people, but a shifting presence like sea, ice reforming, moving beneath clouds. Their migration across the top of the world was not a conquest, but a journey of listening to the wind, to the ocean, to the quiet signals of survival. Their gradual retreat from certain regions may have been a final act of listening to not a failure, but an attunement to change, to choose to move rather than to resist, to adapt without resistance, to accept the silence where once there was song. Today, when archaeologists brush away snow to reveal the outline of a Thule dwelling, or when a child in Nunavut carves a shape that echoes one found centuries before on a remote island shore, the line between past and present narrows. We are not looking at disappearance. We are looking at continuity in motion. The Thule remind us that history is not always a tale of collapse or conquest. Sometimes it is a gentle turning, like the seasons they so carefully followed. a migration, not only across space, but through time, a vanishing that is not absence, but transformation. And in the quiet they left behind, there is a profound kind of presence and invitation to move more gently, to listen more deeply, and to remember that even in the coldest places, life leaves warmth if you know where to feel for it. Aokigahara's quiet heart, Japan forest of suicides and silence. In the shadow of Mount Fuji, where ancient lava once cooled into solid waves beneath centuries of forest growth, lies Aokigahara, place of profound stillness, draped in the heavy hush of trees that have stood watch for generations. This forest, sometimes called the Sea of Trees, stretches across 35 square kilometers of dense, moss-covered roots and twisted trunks that rise like slow exhalations from the volcanic floor. Beneath their canopy, sunlight struggles to penetrate, and sound is curiously muffled by the porous rock below. Even footsteps feel quieter here, as if the ground itself absorbs motion and memory alike. It is a forest defined not by movement, but by a curious stillness, a place where even the wind seems to tread softly. To walk here is not to pass through an ordinary wood, but to enter something much more ancient, more inward. Time folds differently. Under these trees, the density of growth gives the impression of isolation even a few steps from a path, and moss creeps up the trunks in shades of deep green that seem untouched by season. Birds, when they call, sound far away, and every direction looks the same, which can gently disorient the mind and invite introspection. This sense of disconnection, of stillness beyond what we often allow ourselves, has long drawn both reverence and unease. Aokigahara holds stories layered, unspoken, and lingering in the bark and soil. Some speak of the forest's spiritual charge, rooted in ancient beliefs of Ural, spirits said to dwell in places where life ended with longing unresolved. Others speak of the way the forest invites solitude, not to harm but to reflect. It is true that Aokigahara has been associated with sadness, often referred to in whispers as a place where people come to leave life behind. But to dwell only on this association is to overlook its deeper, quieter essence. The forest does not judge those who enter it. It simply holds space, wide and green and patient. It offers a kind of silence that is increasingly rare in our world. Silence that can cradle sorrow, but also stillness. A place where breath slows and thoughts stretch into the canopy above. For centuries, long before modern headlines shaped its reputation, Aokigahara was considered sacred ground. Lava tubes form quiet caves, lined with ice even in summer, and ancient trails once led pilgrims along its edge in meditation and reverence. Trees here have adapted uniquely to the land, growing with shallow roots in hardened stone, yet still finding a way to thrive. In this, there is a quiet lesson: resilience without struggle, growth without noise. The forest lives on volcanic rock, once born of fire and now hosting life in every crevice. It is both a reminder of destruction and a testament to regeneration, carrying both the echo of eruption and the hush of renewal. Local legends tell of spirits who wander, not as threats, but as symbols of memory, the lingering presence of human stories seeking to be heard. These tales are not shouted in fear, but spoken softly, like the wind that threads through the branches or the subtle patterns of lichen along old stones. In this forest, disappearance does not feel abrupt. It feels gradual, like mist blending into the air, or like a person becoming smaller as they walk away, not gone, just farther than we can follow. Visitors often describe a change in perception while walking its trails, not terror, but reverence, not confusion, but a gentle loss of bearings that frees one from the ordinary march of time. Aokigahara does not try to convince or challenge, it simply invites, and some who accept that invitation find a space where their own thoughts speak louder than the noise they left behind. In recent years, efforts have been made to shift the conversation around the forest. Signs at entrances offer messages of hope and encouragement. Local volunteers patrol not to interrupt, but to offer presence. There is care here not only for those who might be in pain, but for the forest itself, which asks not to be reduced to headlines or shadows. It is a living place, deserving of attention that goes beyond mystery and touches meaning. The forest breathes slowly, with centuries in each inhalation. Its mosses absorb not only water, but time, and in that absorption lies a kind of peace. The notion that one can be completely surrounded by trees, by history, by the weight and grace of quieties, something rare in a world so full of noise. Aokigahara allows for stillness, for vanishing not as tragedy, but as surrender to something vaster than the self. There is no urgency here, no path one must take, only trees, only stones, only the hush of nature holding steady. And perhaps that is why its aura feels both somber and serene. The forest does not lure or repel, it simply exists, unwavering, while humans come and go. It is not haunted, but aware. It does not offer answers, but it holds space for questions. In this way, Aokigahara shares something with the snowfields of the Arctic or the drifting ships of forgotten seas, a place where boundaries blur, where what is real and what is imagined meet quietly, and where the passage of time is marked not by clocks, but by the soft rhythm of nature's breath. Those who speak of the forest often focus on its mystery, but its true power may lie in its presence, a presence that neither demands nor retreats, but stays patient, rooted, and open. A forest not of endings, but of pause, not of fear, but of depth. And like many places touched by myth, Aokigahara cannot be reduced to any single narrative. It is not merely the backdrop of sorrow, nor the home of ghosts. It is a forest that listens, a forest that waits, a forest where silence does not threaten, but soothes. And in the quiet of its branches, beneath the shifting light filtered through green and shadow, it invites us to do the same, to listen, to breathe, to remember that mystery, when held gently, becomes something tender, something sacred, something, perhaps, very close to peace. Bennington Triangle, 1945 to 1950, Vermont's snowy, vanishing zone. Nestled in the quiet southwestern corner of Vermont lies a stretch of land that whispers through pine needles and snowdrifts, where the mountains seem to lean inward and silence folds itself over time. This region, now poetically referred to as the Bennington Triangle, encompasses a patchwork of forest, trails, and stone that circles around Glastonbury Mountain, an area steeped in stillness and shadow. Between the years of 1945 and 1955, people disappeared here without trace, without struggle, and without conclusion, leaving behind not just their stories but an enduring sense of pause. These vanishings, each peculiar in its own way, did not cry out for attention, but rather melted into the landscape like footprints in fresh snow, vanishing as quietly as they came. What gives the Bennington Triangle its mysterious weight is not the drama of these disappearances, but the way they seem suspended in the air, hanging over the land like fog that never lifts. The mountain itself was once a place of industry. In the 19th century, Glastonbury bustled with loggers and charcoal workers. its slopes echoing with the rhythm of carts and boots and saws. But as industry declined, so too did the human presence. Towns were abandoned, railways ceased to run, nature reclaimed what it once yielded, and the forest thickened, the trails overgrew, and quiet returned. Some locals believe the mountain never wanted people there. Long before the term Bennington Triangle was coined, native tribes in the region reportedly avoided the mountain, regarding it as cursed or spiritually unsettled. They spoke of strange winds, unpredictable weather, and a deep stillness that seemed to envelop those who wandered too far. The land did not retreat, withdrew. And it is within this withdrawn terrain that the 5 disappearances unfolded, each like a stone dropped into still water, sending out ripples but never returning to the surface. The first was Middy Rivers, a 74-year-old local who knew the trails. Well, in November 1945, he was leading a group of hunters along familiar paths when he walked ahead of the group and was never seen again. They found no sign of struggle, no trace of equipment, no clear direction in which he might have gone. A single rifle cartridge was found in a nearby stream, but it offered no answer, only more questions. The following year, on a December afternoon, in 1946, 8-year-old Paula Weldon set off for a hike along the long trail. She wore a red coat and was seen by several witnesses, including drivers who gave her a lift to the trailhead, but she never returned. Hundreds joined the search, including police, students, and even the FBI. But no footprints, no clothing, no trace of her was ever found. Her disappearance struck a chord across the state, prompting Vermont to form its own state police force. Due to the limitations revealed in the search, 2 years later, in 1949, a man named James Tetford vanished while riding a bus back to the Bennington soldiers' home. Fellow passengers confirmed he had been seated in his place as the bus approached its destination, but when it stopped, he was gone, his belongings still on the seat, his ticket still in his coat. There were no stops between his last sighting and the arrival point. No explanation was offered, nor any evidence discovered. It was as though he had slipped between the seams of the world. In 1950, 2 disappearances followed. First was Paul Jepson, who had been playing near his family's truck while his mother tended to pigs at the local dump. She returned only minutes later, and he was gone. Despite a swift response and search dogs, the trail led to the mountains and simply ended. As though the wind had picked him up and tucked him behind a tree the searchers could not see. Only weeks later, 53-year-old Frida Langer, an experienced hiker, fell into a brook while walking with her cousin near Somerset Reservoir. She returned to camp to change clothes, saying she'd catch up shortly, but never did. Hers was the only body eventually found 7 months later, oddly located in an area that had already been extensively searched. The condition of the body made it impossible to determine cause. These stories, though spanning only 5 years, created an invisible boundary around Glastonbury. They weren't connected by any apparent patternages, ranged from a child to an elderly man, times of year varied, and the weather conditions were different each time. Yet what tied them together was the quiet. None of the disappearances involved signs of distress, struggle, or warning. There were no cries, no messages, no footprints that led out and never back. Instead, there was just space gaps where people had been and were no longer. Over time, stories of the region began to fill those gaps with speculation. Some spoke of magnetic anomalies in the area, subtle distortions that might disorient even experienced hikers. Others imagined pockets of time folding over themselves, places where one might step slightly wrong and fall out of sync with the world. And then there were whispers of something watching, not malevolent, but ancient and unknowable. The forest did not shout, it observed, but beyond the supernatural, there remains the gentler mystery. How the land holds its silence so well. Snow falls heavily here, and mist often curls round the peaks in a way that muffles sound and sight alike. In the woods, the underbrush is thick, the light filtered through branches in endless shades of green and grey. A person walking only a short distance from a trail might be unseen for hours, even days. And if they sit still, whether by choice or mischance, the forest closes in with calm and patience. There are no monsters in these stories, only the suggestion of something greater than understanding. A land not hostile, but indifferent. One that holds its secrets not out of malice, but out of habit. The Bennington Triangle reminds us that not all questions need resolution, and not all endings are meant to be written. There is a peace in not knowing, just as there is a certain comfort in recognizing that nature continues whether or not we trace every footprint. The people who vanished here are not forgotten, but they have become part of the place, woven into the trails and leaves and wind. And when hikers tread quietly through Glastonbury today, they do so with a kind of reverence, pausing at the same brooks, following the same ridges, aware not only of the beauty but of the hush that lives among the trees. That hush is not emptiness, it is presence, and perhaps that is the most profound part of the mystery. Not that people disappeared, but that the forest remains unchanged, waiting without urgency, holding its breath as it always has, in snow and rain, in sun and shadow. It does not speak, but it listens. Bridgewater Triangle's frozen echoes. 1970s, New England's haunted. Woods, tucked away in the southeast of Massachusetts, lies a stretch of land that many walk through without, knowing they've stepped into something quietly peculiar. Spanning approximately 200 square miles and loosely triangulated between Abingdon, Rehoboth, and Freetown, the Bridgewater Triangle is not defined by sharp lines or flashing signs, but by atmosphere, by a silence that lingers too long, by frost that clings even in late spring, and by stories that settle like snowflakes on the tongue, soft and cold and hard to describe. It is a place of still woods, frozen marshlands, and winding paths that seem familiar one moment and unfamiliar the next. In the 1970s, reports began to collect like fallen branches, each different in detail but connected by tone. Hikers wandered in with a confident stride and came out uneasy, whispering of sounds they could not trace, distant drumming with no festival nearby, echoing voices with no speaker, cries that floated above the snow-covered ferns like breath in cold air. Some spoke of flickering lights, not bright or blinding, but pale, like stars seen through fog. Others told of invisible footsteps trailing their own, never too close, but never fading away. These weren't tales spun around campfires or shouted. In fear, they were murmured gently by those who had nothing to gain from telling them. What sets the Bridgewater Triangle apart is not a single event or one grand mystery, but a quiet pattern of oddness that repeats across time, like frost tracing the same windows year after year. The land itself is gentle rolling woods, small hills, frozen ponds, but something in the stillness suggests it remembers more than it reveals. Within the triangle lie Hockomock Swamp and the Freetown Fall River State Forest, to names that carry their own quiet weight. The Wampanoag people once called Hockomock the place where spirits dwell, not out of superstition, But perhaps, out of a deep listening, the swamp does not try to frighten. It simply holds its own presence. The same can be said for the forest, where the wind moves through bare trees like a hush through a forgotten story. In the 1970s, winter hikers began, sharing experiences that lacked logic but carried a strange consistency. One man, a biology teacher from Taunton, walked a trail near the forest's edge and reported hearing a woman singing not loudly, but clearly, and with a melody that stayed with him for weeks. He found no other soul, only his own footprints. In the snow, another hiker, a woman walking near the Raynham Woods in early March, claimed to feel a strong pulse under her feet, as if the ground itself was breathing slowly. She paused, stood still, and felt it again, rhythmic, like something ancient sleeping beneath the frozen earth. A pair of snowshoers, cutting a trail near Lake Nipperneket, came across animal tracks they could not identify. They followed them for an hour before the prints simply stopped, mid-stride, in a clearing without trees or shelter. They turned back. They did not return to that trail again. These stories do not shout. They murmur. They do not ask to be solved. They ask only to be respected, to be listened to without the burden of skepticism. The Bridgewater Triangle, especially in winter, offers that kind of space, the kind where time feels stretched thin, where one's breath seems louder than expected, where the snow absorbs more than sound. During those years, a handful of hikers disappeared completely. None of them were found in distress. None left behind clear paths or reasons. One young man, hiking alone in early January, was last seen at the forest's southern boundary. His car remained in the lot for weeks until spring. Thaw. No sign of his passage was ever located, not even when the snow melted and search teams combed the woods. Another case involved a pair of brothers, both experienced with the terrain, who split off from a snowmobiling group for what they called just a short loop. One returned an hour later, the other never did. The stories made small columns. In local papers, there was no frenzy, no fevered speculation, just winter's stillness and the acknowledgement that the land does not always return what it holds. Perhaps the most unsettling tales came not from disappearances, but from returners who did come back, but quietly changed. A college student hiking alone in 1978 later described how time seemed to slow like syrup as he crossed a snow-dusted ridge. The trees leaned differently, he said, and he heard a sound he could only describe as wind humming in reverse. He came down from the hill after only 20 minutes, but his watch marked an hour and a half. He no longer hikes alone. Others spoke of a low bell sound in the forest, like a church chime played underwater, repeating just once every few minutes, never from the same direction. One group of teenagers, camping near Rehoboth, described waking in the night too. Find their firewood rearranged in a spiral, nothing burned, no tracks in the snow. They did not speak loudly of it. They simply packed quietly the next morning and drove home. What makes the Bridgewater Triangle a lasting mystery is not horror, it is rhythm. The rhythm of things almost seen, almost heard, almost known. It is not what screams that haunts us, it is what whispers. It is the gentle unease of realizing you have walked a path before, yet you do not remember when. It is the hush in the snowfall that seems to still. And most of all, it is the knowing that some places do not seek attention, but hold their presence like breath in winter, air visible for a moment, then gone. These woods, blanketed by snow and time, do not chase answers. They invite you only to walk carefully, to listen, and to feel something just beyond the reach of comprehension. There is no danger in the triangle, not in the way we think of it. There is only presence. And in the quiet forests of New England, where the snow falls with the weight of memory and the trees creak with old stories, that presence lingers still calm, steady, and echoing through time. Kolmanskop, Namibia of the North, the Arctic ghost town of Pyramiden, in the high reaches of the Arctic, far above the bustle of cities and the chatter of civilization, rests a place where time seems to have slowed to a hush. Pyramiden, Soviet mining town once full of life, now quietly asleep beneath layers of frost and stillness, nestled at the base of a mountain shaped like a pyramid, from which it takes its name. This frozen outpost on the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard was founded by Sweden in 1910 and later sold to the Soviet Union in 1927. For decades, Pyramiden thrived against the odds, a carefully crafted Soviet society built in a world of snow and ice, where temperatures routinely dipped below -20 and polar night could last for months. And yet, within that extreme environment, greenhouses grew cucumbers. A large cultural center played classical music, and murals of muscular workers and wheat fields graced the walls as reminders of distant soil. Children once played in courtyards, now filled with snowdrifts. Families once lived, worked, and dreamed in buildings whose windows now gaze emptily into the wind. At its peak in the 1980s, the town was home to over 1,000 residence miners, doctors, teachers, artists, all brought together by coal, by ideology, and by the hope of building something human in a place where even nature whispers sparingly. But like all distant dreams, Pyramiden began to dim. In 1998, the mine was closed without fanfare, and the people one by one, then all at once left. Yet, unlike many abandoned places, Pyramiden was not erased by time or claimed entirely by decay. It was, instead, paused. Today, the silence here is not empty, it is echoing, filled with the breath of what once was. Inside the school, notebooks still sit open on desks, chalk lingers on blackboards, and shoes rest beneath coat hooks, as if the children might return from recess at any moment. The swimming pool, drained long ago, still smells faintly of chlorine beneath layers of frost. In the grand music hall, the grand piano, the northernmost in the world, sits upright, its keys waiting, its last notes hanging softly in a room where footsteps no longer echo. There are no broken windows, no graffiti, no loud deconely stillness and snow. The cold has preserved the town like a forgotten letter, sealed and waiting to be read. Pyramiden's design was not accidental. It was deliberate, a model Soviet city meant to remind its people of home even while they stood on the edge of the earth. A statue of Lenin still watches over the main square, his gaze fixed toward the Nordenskiöld glacier. Behind him, a mural proclaims the glory of work and progress, silent now, yet intact. This preservation lends Pyramiden a surreal beauty. The layers of history here are not buried, they're simply dusted in snow. The cafeteria still holds its trays, its menus once listing hearty soups and breads flown in from Moscow. The library remains shelved with Russian classics, their pages unopened since the last reader turned the last page and gently set it down. Even the post office still contains unsent letters, as if the sender paused, uncertain of what to say from so far away. Walking through this ghost town is like moving through a dream, each corner revealing fragments of life frozen in time, not decayed, but resting. Outside, Arctic foxes patrol the edges of the settlement, while seabirds wheel through skies untouched by engines. The wind carries only the soft crunch of snow underfoot and the occasional creak of a shutter moving gently in the breeze. In winter, when the sun does not rise for months, the town glows in a perpetual twilight, casting long shadows over playground swings and factory rails, reminding us of the lives that once moved between them. In summer, brief and startlingly bright, wildflowers briefly bloom in patches between the buildings, and sunlight glints off the windows of apartments where no curtains are drawn. There's no tragedy, here only stillness, no chaos, only memory. Pyramiden does not demand answers or evoke fear. It invites reflection. Why do people build so far from what they know? What dreams carry them to the edge of the world? And what remains when they leave not in stone or steel, but in the feeling? A place holds long after footsteps fade. These are the soft questions Pyramiden asks, not with words, but with silence. And perhaps that's what makes it feel so deeply human. Like Kolmanskop in the Namibian desert, where sand drifts through the empty shells of German colonial houses, Pyramiden too is a testament to the impermanence of certainty. But unlike the sands of Namibia, which move quickly and bury all, the Arctic snow moves softly, preserving more than it erases. The cold here is not cruel, it is patient. It keeps secrets not out of spite, but out of reverence. Pyramiden is not haunted. It is held by wind, by memory, by ice that gently clutches what once thrived. And as the world below spins ever faster, this quiet town remains a slow whisper of a time when people believed they could build hope even where the earth no longer sings. Some travelers still visit, guided by local experts who maintain the town's fragile structures. They walk respectfully, taking nothing, touching little, speaking softly. For in a place like this, even a footstep feels like an interruption. Those who leave rarely forget it. The Arctic air, the preserved playgrounds, the sense of a life paused, it lingers in the mind long after the boat departs. Pyramiden is not a place of endings. It is a place of stillness. And in our hurried world, where stories are often shouted and moments quickly forgotten, perhaps that's its most enduring offering. Not an answer, not a mystery to be solved, but a moment to breathe beside history, to pause, and to listen to what remains when everything else has gone quiet. Spitsbergen's white desert, trappers who never came home, in the far northern reaches of the Svalbard archipelago, where the sun vanishes for months and the winds sweep like breath across endless snowfields, lies Spitsbergen, a white desert shaped by cold and time, by silence and solitude. This island, cloaked in perpetual frost for much of the year, is a place where footsteps do not linger and where memory floats like mist over frozen fjords. In the early 20th century, as the world below buzzed with invention and noise, a few men came north in quiet pursuit, trappers who sought foxes and bears, seals and polar hides, believing in the promise of fur-lined fortune and in the ancient solitude of the Arctic. They built small wooden huts, tucked into hillsides, or standing alone near icy shores, lit by oil lamps, warmed by coal stoves, their walls lined with tools and hope. These cabins were not places of comfort, but of survival, outposts of patience. An endurance where the closest sound might be the distant crack of sea ice or the low hum of wind against a window pane. Men came in pairs or trios, often remaining through the long winter, wrapped in darkness, writing journals by candlelight, hunting by instinct, dreaming of warmth and return. And yet, in some of these quiet cabins, return never came. One spring, As supply ships crept back through the thawing Arctic waters, they found doors left ajar, food left untouched, and fires long gone cold. In several isolated stations, trappers had simply vanished. No signs of violence, no footprints through snow that should have preserved them, just silence and the soft imprint of time. In one cabin, a journal remained open, its last entry mundane, noting the weather, the condition of a trap, and nothing more. In another, a teacup rested beside a rusted lantern, as if someone had just stepped outside and never returned. The most curious trail was found outside a station near the Rindalan Valley. Here, wolf tracks were discovered circling the cabin, moving slowly outward, then away, as though the animals had waited. But no human tracks accompanied them, no signs of a chase or a struggle. It was as if the trappers had dissolved into the frost, as quietly as they had arrived. Stories spread among those who remained, a few who braved another season. Some whispered of sudden illness, though no bodies were ever found. Others speculated about unstable ice or hidden crevasses that swallowed men without a sound. A few spoke of madness, the slow unraveling that can come with 6 months of darkness and the haunting stillness of snow. Yet these were only ideas, and the Arctic, faithful to its nature, offered no answers. It never has. What we know is this: the cabins remain. Their doors creak softly in the wind. Their windows are clouded with time. Inside, you can still see the oil lamps, the bunk beds with woolen blankets folded neatly at the corners, the worn traps hung on nails, and boots set by the threshold, as though waiting for feet that will never return. Nature has not taken them entirely. The snow preserves, the cold protects, and so these small wooden places sit like unopened letters scattered across the island. Researchers and explorers have occasionally visited them, walking respectfully, leaving everything as they found it. For in a place like this, even a whisper feels loud. And while technology has mapped most of Spitsbergen, it has not explained its silences. These vanishings are not loud tragedies. They are subtle absences that echo more powerfully for their lack of drama. A cup left half full, a coat still hanging on a hook, a trail that ends in nothing. They ask no questions, yet they leave us full of them. Who were these men? What final thoughts flickered in their minds as they stepped into the white expanse? Did they feel wonder or only cold? And why, in a place so open, so flat and wide, can a person disappear so completely? These aren't just mysteries of geography, but of human presence, how someone can be somewhere and then not, without disturbance, or evidence, leaving only air and snowfall in their place. Spitsbergen's landscape does not offer warmth. It does not yield its stories easily, but it does offer something quieter, an invitation to feel small, to feel still, and to reflect on how much we don't know. The cold here is not cruel, it is honest. It reveals the edge of human effort, the outer boundary of endurance, and it keeps its secrets the way the sea keeps depth, without malice, but with certainty. Some say the men walked onto thin ice, others that a sudden storm blinded them within steps of their shelter. But those are guesses, shaped by the need to explain. In truth, we are left only with the quiet image, a cabin by a hill, a stove cold for decades, and wolf tracks walking calmly into the snow. There are no monsters here, no hidden claws or shadows moving through trees. There is only vastness and time and the soft snow that covers all things equally. Perhaps the lesson of Spitsbergen is not to seek what cannot be found, but to sit gently with mystery itself, to accept that not all stories are finished, not all trails lead to answers, Some remain open-ended, like a journal entry that trails off mid-sentence, or a teacup left full beside a lantern. These are not failures of closure, they are invitations to wonder, and in that wondering, we find something unexpected, not fear, but peace. For to sleep beside a question is not to be disturbed, but to be gently reminded of how vast the world is, and how soft its silences can be. The chilling howl of Mount St. Elias, disembodied voices on the wind, high above the Alaskan frontier, where the sky hangs heavy and pale, and clouds drift like forgotten sails across peaks carved by glaciers and centuries of stillness. Mount St. Elias rises like a quiet sentinel between two worlds, standing over 18,000 feet tall. It is the second highest mountain in both the United States and Canada, towering formation of snow, rock, and ice that rarely makes headlines, yet holds a presence so vast and unyielding that climbers often describe its approach as humbling, almost reverent. Far removed from the bustle of modern alpinism, this mountain exists in a realm where solitude becomes complete, where the only companions are the biting winds and the long shadows cast by distant ridges. And within this hushed dominion, strange tales have been passed softly between the few who have dared ascend its slopes, accounts, not of danger, but of something far more elusive, voices, not the sharp calls of avalanche or the howls of wind that sometimes mimic the human cry, but whispers, thin, rhythmic, melodic, carried along the high ridgelines and through narrow gullies like fragments of a story no one ever fully hears. Climbers in various decades, from expeditioners in the 1950s to solo adventurers in more recent years, have quietly reported the same sensation, a soft murmur rising above the shriek of the storm, not consistent, but fleeting, only audible when everything else stills. At times, it is described as indistinct humming, other times as scattered words in no known language, and sometimes simply as the presence of something unseen yet deeply aware. None of these accounts come with drama or alarm. Rather, they are offered with a kind of wonder, a shrug of uncertainty, and always the caveat: maybe it was nothing, maybe it was wind, but it didn't feel like wind. On one ascent in 1974, a 3-person team camped near a narrow icefall on the southwest face of the mountain. That night, all 3 recalled waking separately, hearing what they thought was the sound of a 4th person pacing outside the tent. Yet no footprints were found the next morning. More curious still was their shared recollection of hearing low chanting H, describing it slightly differently, yet all agreeing it came in waves, rising and falling like breath. No recordings exist. These aren't stories told for fame or fear, but memories shared reluctantly, often years after the fact, and always with a tone of quiet contemplation. The mountain, after all, offers no answers. Geologists and glaciologists speak of acoustic phenomena, how pressure ridges and fractured ice can channel wind in such a way that it creates harmonic vibrations. This is true, and yet those who've heard it say the explanation, while logical, doesn't quite capture the feeling, not just of sound, but of being near something else, not threatening, but watching, not present in body, but echoing, as if the mountain holds more than stone and frost. Indigenous stories from the region, long predating modern climbing, also whisper of the mountain's voice. The Tlingit and Yakutat peoples, who've lived in the shadows of these peaks for generations, speak of sacred mountains that breathe and speak not in human tongues, but in the language of the land, of memory, and of time. These tales, always told with deep respect, are never framed as superstition. They are simply part of the landscape, a recognition that some places are alive in ways we do not fully understand. Mount St. Elias, straddling the liminal space between nations, between ocean and inland glacier, between sky and earth, seems to be one of those places. Its remoteness ensures that only a few pass through each year, and perhaps that's why. It remains as it is, undisturbed, uncommercialized, and unburdened by too much explanation. In 1991, a documentary crew attempting to capture high-altitude wind effects abandoned some of their footage after multiple field mics recorded strange harmonics above 15,000 feet. What began as scientific research turned into a catalogue of unidentifiable noise layers of overlapping frequencies that, when slowed down, resembled voices layered over each other. They didn't claim it was paranormal. They simply chose not to use it. The wind, they said, was too much. But the few audio engineers who listened privately described the recordings as oddly human, unintelligible, but unmistakably shaped like language. There's no great mystery to solve. Here, no missing climbers, no abandoned gear, no strange symbols scratched into stone. Only an ongoing thread that pulls gently through time. Those who sleep on the mountain or move through its high passes, in solitude, often return with the same look in their eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but awe, as if they heard something that reminded them how vast the world truly is. We often think of sound as something meant to be understood, but perhaps some sounds exist simply to be felt, like music in a language we've never learned. In that way, the wind on Mount St. Elias may not be trying to speak to us, it may simply be singing, echoing the stories of those who came before, or the dreams of the ice itself. And so, this chapter is not one of disappearance, or tragedy, or revelation. It is one of presence, of standing on a snowfield so high and wide that the curve of the earth feels close, of sitting by your tent in the stillness before dawn and hearing something you cannot explain, and choosing not to chase it, but to let it pass through you, to let the mountain's breath become part of your own, because not all mysteries want to be solved. Some, like the whispers on Mount St. Elias, want only to be carried, gently, quietly, and without fear, like snowflakes that fall, melt, and disappear, having never asked to be known, only felt. Paradoxical undressing, victims who shed clothes in hypothermia. There are few environments on earth as quietly powerful as snowbound wilderness, where time seems to move at the pace of snowfall, and silence becomes a landscape all its own. In such places, where the cold is not merely a season but a condition of being, the human body responds in deeply instinctive ways, some understood, some still wrapped in mystery. Among these quiet puzzles of nature is a phenomenon both simple and unsettling, known to search and rescue workers, mountaineers, and polar researchers alike. Paradoxical undressing. It is a clinical term, a medical observation, but it carries with it a strange hush, as if the behavior it describes asks not to be shouted about, but quietly considered. In cases of severe hypothermia, it has been documented, again and again, that some individuals, near the final stages of cold exposure, begin to remove their clothing piece by piece, folding or casting away layers that minutes earlier stood between them and the freezing air. It appears illogical, even irrational, and yet it is not chaos. Often, those affected do it slowly, deliberately, sometimes placing the clothes beside them as if preparing for sleep. The paradox lies in the contradiction. At the very moment the body should crave warmth most, it acts to shed it. And as with many mysteries of the mind and body, It is not entirely unexplained, but it is not fully understood either. Scientists believe this response may be the result of misfiring signals in the body's thermoregulation system. As core temperature drops dangerously low, blood vessels that had constricted to preserve warmth may suddenly dilate. This sudden rush of warm blood from the core to the extremities may give the illusion of overheating, tricking the brain into sensing intense heat. The person, overwhelmed by what feels like unbearable warmth, begins to remove clothes, unaware that what they feel is not heat, but its opposite. This response occurs in the late stages of hypothermia, often shortly before unconsciousness sets in. But what makes paradoxical undressing more than a physiological footnote is the eerie way it recurs in cold weather tragedies across the decades. From lonely hikers in alpine passes to lost travelers in snowy forests, stories have surfaced where victims were found partially or fully unclothed in temperatures far below freezing, with no evidence of struggle or injury, only the puzzle of why warmth was cast aside in the very moment it was needed most. This detail, small and easily misunderstood, has at times led to further confusion in such cases. Some early investigators, unaware of the phenomenon, misread these scenes as evidence of foul play or irrational behavior. But as more became known, a pattern emerged, quiet, consistent, and almost poetic in its contradiction. Among the most well-known references to paradoxical undressing is the case of the Dyatlov Pass incident of 1959, where several members of a hiking group were discovered in various states of undress in the snow-bound Ural mountains of Soviet Russia. While many theories have swirled around that event, from the grounded to the fantastic, some experts believe paradoxical undressing played a role in the final hours of the hikers' lives. But Dyatlov is not alone. Sir Chandraskew reports from Scandinavia, Canada, Japan, and the Alps repeat the motif. Footprints that lead nowhere. Bodies curled beneath trees or beside stones. Outerwear discarded nearby, as if something internal took precedence over all logic. And while hypothermia affects everyone differently, this particular response has been noted in both the experienced and the untrained. Paradoxical undressing does not stem from ignorance. It arises from something deeper, the body's desperate attempt to navigate its own fading signals. What touches people most about this mystery is not the science behind it, though that is worth knowing. It is the imagery, the stillness of a snow-covered forest, the way a trail simply ends, the tenderness with which some of the removed garments are found folded, not flung, as if the person believed they were preparing for a rest that would soon end. There's a certain peace in that, however haunting it may seem. The snow does not judge. The cold is not cruel. They simply are, and those caught in their embrace sometimes enter a state where the border between confusion and calm becomes thin. In some documented cases, rescuers have reported finding signs that the person had tried to burrow, digging into the snow like a creature seeking shelter. Others appear to have wandered in slow circles, suggesting a dreamlike disorientation. These actions, paired with undressing, form what is known as terminal burrowing behavior, another stage in the final progression of hypothermia. Together, these responses reflect not panic, but the body's final efforts to protect itself, even if those efforts no longer make sense to the waking mind. In a way, paradoxical undressing reminds us how much of human behavior is rooted not in thought, but in instinct. It is a quiet testimony to how, even in the coldest moments, the body tries to find its way home. And perhaps that's why the phenomenon lingers in the minds of those who study it, not as a gruesome detail, but as something gently tragic. There is no violence in these moments, only silence, snow, and the last flickers of warmth misunderstood. In many ways, this mystery is not meant to be solved. We can chart the blood flow, measure core temperature, and diagram neural pathways, but we cannot quite capture the subjective sensation of what it feels like to stand at the edge of warmth and cold, and choose without meaning to what feels right. And it is this very mystery, this intersection of biology and humanity, that makes paradoxical undressing not just a clinical note in a textbook, but a story one told softly, like a snowflake landing on fabric, vanishing before it can be examined. As we reflect on it, we are reminded that not all mysteries cry out for attention. Some remain quiet, humbling, and unresolved. And sometimes, the greatest respect we can give them is not to interrogate, but to understand their place in the greater. A story of how we live and how we fade. In the end, paradoxical undressing is not about fear or failure. It is about the delicate balance between body and world, about the thresholds we don't always recognize until they've been crossed, and perhaps, when the cold wraps gently around a wandering soul, it is not confusion they feel, but a kind of return to stillness, to silence, and to something deeper than cold, peace. Ice needle phenomenon, sharp spires that tear flesh in the night, in the quiet corners of Earth's coldest places, far beyond the warmth of settlements, and beyond the reach of roads, lie regions where nature carves in silence, leaving behind shapes so delicate and strange that they appear more imagined than real. One such phenomenon, rare and often unnoticed except by those who travel deep into the frost, is the formation of sharp crystalline structures called ice needles. Unlike the familiar frost on windows or soft blankets of snow that hush the world, beneath, these needles do not simply rest on the landscape, they rise from it. Narrow and glass-like, slender as the thinnest shard and often rigid to the touch. They do not grow from rainfall or drift down from clouds, and wind is not always their artist. Instead, they seem to push themselves upward from the very soil or ice, born not of aggression but of precise conditions, moisture in the ground, a particular chill in the air, and a surface ready to surrender its warmth. Their growth is silent, patient, and strangely purposeful, like nature working on a thread of frozen time. Often they remain hidden, brittle and glinting, visible only to those who know how to look under moonlight or early dawn when light brushes the land without melting it. Hikers and Arctic researchers have stumbled upon them unexpectedly, tiny spires crowding beneath the snow crust, or rising in unexpected clusters like frozen quills from the earth, though they are usually fragile and vanish with the sun's first breath. In some conditions, these ice needles grow large and stiff, and their forms take on an unsettling presence, jagged, layered, almost blade-like. There have been rare but curious accounts from wilderness guides and climbers who report minor injuries while walking through an otherwise calm patch of frost, small cuts on ankles or fingertips, where contact with these nearly invisible shards left marks, not deep but oddly sharp, as if the landscape itself had grown a thin defensive coat overnight. Of course, the science behind such phenomena has roots in basic physics. When the soil is moist and the surface air suddenly cools, water in the ground may rise through capillary action, freezing as it reaches the surface and pushing up columns of ice in the process. It is a quiet pressure, repeating over hours or even days, and the result can be long, needle-like structures standing vertically from the earth. In Japan, This is known as Juyo. In certain regions of Europe, it has nicknames like ice flowers or frost columns. Yet despite these explanations, what gives the ice needle its hold on the imagination is not the mechanics of its formation, but its eerie appearance and behavior. In remote, windless valleys, some formations have been discovered aligned like rows of tiny spears, pointing skyward from the edge of glacial caves, or along ridgelines where no recent human or animal tracks are found. Their arrangement, nor the random nor quite symmetrical, gives the impression of a natural intelligence, not conscious but exact. What makes them even more mysterious is that these formations sometimes vanish just as quickly as they appear. A traveler might walk a path in the morning and find it glittering with strange frost columns, only to return a few hours later to bare ground. The temperature might have changed only slightly, or not at all, and the cause of their disappearance may be unclear. Even in modern meteorology, not every aspect of needle ice formation is perfectly understood. While the general process is documented, the exact conditions under which particularly large or oddly shaped formations appear remain elusive. In high-altitude regions of Siberia, Scandinavia, and Alaska, certain shapes have been reported that resemble crystalline feathers, standing upright in clusters as if they had been carefully placed there. Others describe what look like frost spines, running along rocks in perfectly parallel rows, like ancient writing etched in ice. In places like the Antarctic interior, where few venture and where instruments outnumber observers, some satellite imagery has shown reflections that suggest widespread needle formations, though they vanish before confirmation. What deepens the sense of mystery is the occasional tale passed between cold-weather researchers and explorers, always quiet, always cautious of areas where the air seemed charged in their presence, or where sound seemed muffled unnaturally near the formations. There's no science to confirm such sensations, of course, but the mind does strange things when surrounded by silence, ice, and the unknown, and so slowly the ice needle has become something of a ghost story among those who walk the polar paths, not one of fear, but of awe. The idea that the ground can grow spikes in the night, invisible to most eyes, waiting not to harm, but to exist briefly, exquisitely, before melting back into earth feels less like weather and more like a message. A whisper from the planet that not all cold is still, not all frost is soft, and not all danger is loud. Yet, in all its oddity, the phenomenon remains peaceful. It is not hostile. The injuries, when they happen, are mild and rare. The formations vanish with light. There is no menace in the ice needle-only mystery. It asks nothing of us except attention, a slowing of pace, a pause to look. And perhaps that's the lesson it offers, that even in the most silent places, where everything seems asleep, there is movement, quiet, precise, beautiful movement, rising upward without warning, shining for just a moment before it forgets itself and fades. In our age of answers and explanations, the ice needle reminds us that some things are still becoming, still surprising, still sharp with the unknown. And so we walk gently, carefully, through frostbitten trails and dawn-covered meadows, knowing that somewhere beneath our boots, something delicate may be rising, not to block our way, but to remind us that even the coldest places are alive and watching, and quietly creating wonders we may never fully understand. Tunguska's frozen forest, 1908, trees flattened. Skies aglow in the quiet heart of Siberia. Near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River lies a stretch of taiga where the trees still whisper about a morning long. Past June 30th, 1908, when something from above arrived not with sound and fury, but with light and strangeness that has never fully faded. It was early, not yet breakfast, for the few hunters and herders who roamed those forests, when the sky split with a brilliance brighter than the sun, and a soft thunder followed by wind that flattened nearly 800 square miles of dense pine forest, toppling an estimated 80 million trees, not in chaos, but in curious radial patterns, as if something had exploded above them in the sky. But what makes the Tunguska event so deeply mysterious isn't just the scale or power of this unexplained blast. It is what wasn't found. For all the devastation, there was no crater, no remains, no object embedded in the earth. The epicenter revealed only scorched trees still standing like sentinels, their trunks stripped of branches, while those further out lay fallen in outward rings, as if carefully arranged by an invisible hand. Locals spoke of skies that glowed blue at night. For days afterward, far beyond Siberia, even in places like London, newspaper readers noted strange lights in the evening. Scientists would later suggest that ice particles high in the atmosphere, stirred by whatever happened above Tunguska, had reflected sunlight across continents. But even now, no single explanation settles the unease. Some early witnesses described the sensation not of destruction, but of the air itself being disturbed, as if the breath of the sky had momentarily thickened. Others recalled animals running before sound, as if they sensed something not yet present. For decades, no formal expedition reached the area due to its remoteness and the turmoil of early 20th century Russia. When researchers finally ventured in during the late 1920s, led by Soviet scientist Leonid Kulik, they were met not by debris or obvious evidence, but by silence. Birds returned. New trees had begun to grow. Yet the original damage remained etched in the pattern of the landscape, telling a story without voice. Kulik's team found no fragments of a meteorite, no telltale metallic remains, no clear trace of any impact at all. Their instruments read strange magnetic disruptions in the soil, and trees around the site had growth rings indicating a moment of extraordinary heat and force. But from what hypotheses sprouted, like tundra grass after thaw, the most accepted theory among scientists remains that a stony meteoroid, roughly 100 feet wide, entered Earth's atmosphere and exploded in an airburst at about 5 to 10 kilometers above the surface, releasing energy equivalent to several atomic bombs. But even this remains, in many ways, a placeholder idea framework of probability, resting gently on layers of doubt. Others have speculated more freely. Some speak of comet fragments, with their icy bodies leaving no solid remains. Others drift further into speculation of dark matter, antimatter, or ancient technologies. But in the tone of our quiet reflection, those details are less important than the emotional residue they leave behind. Wonder, the kind that asks not what the answer is, but why we feel drawn to moments like this in the first place. The Tunguska blast didn't just shape trees, it carved something in the imagination. It reminds us how small events in forgotten corners of the world can ripple into legend, not because of their noise, but because of their mystery. There is something oddly gentle about the way nature absorbed this impact. No human lives were officially lost, though one man hundreds of kilometers away was reportedly knocked off his chair. Animals returned, soil healed, trees grew back, but the outline of the event, the radial fall of the forest, the scorched central zone, The strangeness of blue nights remains, like a signature written in elements we don't fully comprehend. Later studies even uncovered that the patterns of tree growth around the epicenter were faster in subsequent decades, suggesting that whatever touched the land had left behind not just destruction, but a kind of peculiar fertility. Perhaps this is nature's way of balancing. The Tunguska event, then, becomes not a tale of devastation, but of transformation. An event so powerful, so unexplained, and yet so quiet in the years that followed that it feels more like myth than memory. Some researchers have simulated similar airburst phenomena to study how energy disperses above the ground. And still, Tunguska's unique signature eludes replication. No modern incident mimics its scale without leaving more behind: debris, noise, records, photos. Tunguska left only burned trees and questions. The idea that something can happen on Earth so large and yet leave so little trace touches something deep in us. It's the same feeling one gets watching distant thunder over a dark ocean, or hearing the soft sound of snow falling in an empty field that hours before held footprints. It's not fear, it's reverence. And perhaps that's what the Tunguska forest teaches most: that not every mystery is waiting to be solved. Some wait only to be witnessed, quietly, patiently, with open eyes and a closed mouth. The sky holds secrets, and the earth keeps their echoes, as we lie back and breathe deeply into the rhythm of sleep. We can imagine walking through those Siberian woods, feeling the hush of trees that once bent in unison, under a force they never saw, only felt. And now they stand again, silently pointing outward, like compass needles drawing invisible circles in the frost. Beneath them, the soil remembers, and above, the stars continue to burn, quietly offering no answers, only their patient, glowing watch. The twisted star of Malmstrom, 1950s Cold War UFO park near Minot, in the hushed expanse of the northern plains, where winter snow blankets vast tracts of land like an endless white parchment. There lies a stretch of quiet earth that once held a strange tension beneath its silencer, place called Malmstrom near Minot, in the chilly grip of 1950s Montana, when the Cold War drew unseen lines across the sky. The airbase there, one of many tucked away in the American North, carried out its duties with discreet precision, overseeing missile silos buried beneath frozen soil, always watching, always waiting, in a time when silence was often just the space between whispered fears. During those years, as radar watched skies and personnel listened to the hum of quiet machines, there came one night, or perhaps several, that would ripple through memory, not with the clarity of confirmed events, but with the soft blur of something felt more than proven. Stories emerged, gently and cautiously, of lights above snow, lights that moved with intention but not menace, hovering near missile sites and casting soft glows that didn't flicker or fade like aircraft or stars. These were not reports from anxious civilians peering through kitchen windows, but from servicemen trained in observation, routine, and repetition. They spoke of brilliant shapes hovering, not loudly but with strange steadiness, moving in formations, sometimes resembling a twisted star, pulsing with symmetry yet unlike any known pattern in aviation. The snow beneath them glowed faintly, not scorched or disturbed, just illuminated as though by moonlight that had learned how to shift. Inside control rooms, alarms flickered, systems reset, and something unusual pressed against the edge of normalcy, though never enough to warrant escalation or fire. Missile silos, secure and silent, sometimes went offline briefly without explanation. their status lights dimming for moments before returning as if nothing had occurred. Reports were logged, not frantic, but careful. Radar picked up nothing, and yet eyes saw. The air was too still, the sky too empty for the disruption to be dismissed as mere malfunction. But in an age of military secrets and international tension, such events were often shelved into quiet categories: anomalies, weather, technical fluctuations, labels that soothed without solving. And so the base went on, operations resumed, and snow continued to fall. Yet whispers persisted. Some called it the twisted star, quiet term passed among those who worked the night shifts, those who heard static where there should have been silence, who glanced up into the dim sky and felt that something was looking back, not unkindly, but curiously. What these lights were, no one could say. They didn't match any known aircraft, nor did they leave behind trails or sound. Some speculated experimental aircraft, others wondered about weather balloons, and a few, in the privacy of low voices and later night watches, dared to suggest origins less earthly. But beyond theories was a consistent feeling, a shared calmness among those who saw the lights, as if the presence was not threatening but observing, as though drawn not to the people but to the machines beneath the frost. Perhaps, they wondered, whatever it was had no interest in conquest or contact, only curiosity. It was not the first time such events were noted near military installations, and it would not be the last. But at Malmstrom, the setting, the snow, the silence, the isolation gave the encounters a particularly surreal stillness, one that softened the sharp edges of the unknown. Decades later, declassified documents and eyewitness testimonies would surface, not loud accusations, but quiet confirmations that something unusual had indeed occurred. Former officers described glowing orbs maneuvering with impossible precision, changing direction without inertia, vanishing in one blink only to reappear in another part of the sky. Some accounts suggested that entire missile systems had gone offline in synchrony with these sightings, a fact noted, investigated, and then gently buried beneath bureaucratic routine. There was no panic, only protocol, and so the twisted star faded into cold memory, a soft myth born in an era that gave little room for myth. But still, its presence lingers in the archives of those who recall, not in alarm, but in awe. It reminds us that even in the most secure and structured environments, the unknown can visit not with force, but with presence. In the context of a storytelling meant to soothe, what emerges is not fear but wonder. What was it that came to Malmstrom? A trick of light, a reflection of our own anticipation, shaped into form by snow and silence, or something older, gentler, watching quietly through the frost-covered night. The landscape remembers. Snow falls the same way it did then, soft, soundless, wrapping earth and memory alike. The silos remain, now more symbolic than active, and the sky continues its quiet turn above them, unchanged by time, untroubled by questions. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what those lights were, but why they chose to come then, and what they saw as they hovered in stillness. The base may have forgotten, the files may be closed, but the cold plains hold echoes, and the wind carries stories that data cannot catch. If one stands alone beneath the stars at Malmstrom, just before dawn, and listens not for sound, but for pause, they may feel it too, the hum of a question that doesn't demand an answer, only acknowledgement. A twisted star once turned here, not to disturb, but to notice. And now, in this space of story and sleep, we notice it too, not with fear, but with gentle curiosity, and a quiet breath beneath a sky that has always held more than clouds. A world made of questions, why cold mysteries endure. There is something in the cold that holds memory differently, as if snow remembers more gently than stone or sand, softening edges and drawing silence over the voices of time, like a blanket laid carefully across forgotten stories. These cold places, frozen peaks, wind-brushed plains, Arctic edges do not shout their history. Instead, they whisper, and what they whisper are not answers, but questions, quiet and unhurried, as though they've grown used to the stillness, to being asked but never fully explained. Across these vast landscapes of frost and ice, where people once walked and then did not, where footprints vanished into drifting snow and cabins stood empty under low skies, there lingers something oddly unifying, not just in their chill, but in their enduring calmness. Each chapter in this long and quiet story we've wandered through, the expedition that never came home, the trappers whose firewood remained stacked, the echoing voices heard on windless ridges, the strange frost-formed spires that cut without. A storm, all of them exist, not just as events, but as places where certainty chose not to stay. They're tied not by location, but by texture, texture made of stillness and unresolved wonder. The more we try to draw them together in lines and logic, the more they gently resist, like snowflakes melting when you look too closely. And yet, this resistance is not frustrating, it's soothing, because there is something deeply restful about accepting the mystery of it all. These stories do not demand our belief or disbelief. They simply invite us to be with them for a while, to sit in the hush that follows a snowfall and feel the shared quiet between then and now. Across centuries, different people have disappeared, witnessed strange lights, found paths that ended too soon, or heard things that logic cannot hold. And in each, we find not panic, but pause, a human moment, frozen not in fear, but in suspension, like breath held before a word is spoken. Why do these cold mysteries linger longer than others? Why do we return to them in thought and story, even when answers never arrive? Perhaps it's because the cold preserves not just bodies or footprints, but possibility. In a world rushing to explain everything, these places gently remind us of something older, that some truths unfold only when we stop seeking conclusions and start listening to what the silence is trying to say. The Arctic wind does not shout, and neither do the vanished. Their stories hang in the air like mist on a frozen lake, visible only when the light strikes at a certain angle. And so we learn, not with data or diagrams, but with attention, not with certainty, but with a kind of reverent curiosity. The world, when viewed through the lens of these snow-covered puzzles, becomes less about mastery and more about presence. We walk gently through these histories, not to dig or uncover, but to sit beside. And in sitting, something in us softens too. Maybe we're drawn to cold mysteries because they reflect a part of ourselves, the quiet questions we've never answered, the moments we've set aside without resolution, the dreams that melted upon waking but left behind a feeling too deep to name. They are not interruptions in the human story. They are part of it. And in embracing them, not solving, just embracing, we let go of the urgency that so often drives us and find instead the rhythm of breath, the falling of snow, the echo of a footstep that never needed to return. A world made of questions is not a broken world. It is a world alive with listening. And in this stillness, under northern stars or Antarctic silence, we realize that the most enduring mysteries are not puzzles to be conquered, but spaces to rest in, to be quiet and to fall asleep beside. Resting beneath the ice, how silence becomes sanctuary. There are places in the world where silence does not feel empty, but so full, in fact, that it feels almost like a presence, a living thing resting lightly across the land, as if sound itself has decided to pause and fold itself into the snow. In these places, particularly the frozen ones, silence doesn't arrive with abruptness. It drifts, slowly and gently, like the soft fall of snowflakes on stone that has not been stepped on in 100 years. When we imagine the vast, untouched reaches of the polar ice caps, the Arctic floes, or ancient glaciers curling against the edges of lonely mountains, what comes first is not danger or hardship, but quiet that is deeper than the absence of words, a quiet that hums beneath the surface like breath sleeping inside the earth. It is in these frozen places that many stories have paused, not ended, just paused. A pair of boots left beside a weathered outpost, a name carved on driftwood, half buried in frost, a journal closed with mittened hands decades ago. These remnants are not cries for attention. They are whispers of stillness, gentle acknowledgments that not every story seeks to be told aloud. Sometimes they seem to say, the most powerful thing one can do is simply be still, beneath the ice. Things are preserved, not destroyed, and preservation does not shout. It holds gently. This kind of stillness becomes its own form of sanctuary, a refuge not from the world, but from its clamor, from the rush to explain, to define, to prove. In this silence, the need for resolution dissolves, and what remains is something more tender, a space to breathe without demand, to exist without pressure, to wonder without urgency. We often think of silence as something to be broken, but here, in the hush of snowbound lands, it is something to be honored. The stories resting beneath the ice, be they of ancient travelers, forgotten civilizations, or solitary souls who once stood beneath the same sky, are not trapped. They are at peace. It's as though the earth itself decided to cradle them in frost, not as punishment, but as a way of keeping them safe from noise, from interpretation, from the weight of retellings that might strip away their nuance. They become something closer to dreams, stories we feel more than understand, impressions we carry rather than recollections we catalogue. And perhaps that is what draws us to them, the way they invite not analysis, but presence, the way they ask nothing but attention, quiet attention, in return. To sit beside these icy sanctuaries is to learn something very old and very gentle, that rest is not an absence of life, but a rhythm of it. The earth sleeps, too. The cold does not erase, slows, and in that slowness there is room for memory, for wonder, for the kind of reflection that only comes when time loses its urgency. We may never know why a set of footprints ended at the edge of a frozen lake, or why an old sled remains upright, though no hands have touched it in generations. But perhaps knowing is not the point. Perhaps being with those questions is enough. The people who once moved through these frozen spaces may not have left behind answers, but they left traces, and traces are invitations, not demands. They invite us to walk gently, to listen carefully, to pause long enough that we might hear what only silence can say. The ice, in its patience, offers us this lesson over and over again. That slowness is sacred, that not every path leads forward some, simply circle back to stillness. And in that stillness, we are not lost, but finally found. These cold places remind us that we don't have to speak to be heard, that we don't have to move to be meaningful, that we don't have to explain to be remembered. There is comfort in this, deep comfort, like the weight of a thick blanket in a dark room, like the way snow softens every edge until even sorrow feels less sharp. Resting beneath the ice is not just an image, it is an invitation to let go of urgency, to lean into the hush, to know that within the cold and quiet lies a kind of warmth, a warmth that doesn't burn but holds. And when we rest alongside it, when we stop chasing meaning and instead simply sit with mystery, we find that sanctuary isn't always something built with hands. Sometimes it's formed from snowflakes and wind and the slow passage of time. Sometimes the most profound peace lies not in what we uncover, but in what we choose to leave untouched. The frozen earth cradles its secrets, not out of malice, but out of mercy. It holds them, it hushes them, it lets them sleep. And in doing so, it reminds us that we, too, can rest not just our bodies, but our questions, our need to always know, always do, always solve. Beneath the ice, everything slows. And in that slowing, we are invited not to give up, but to give in, to surrender to the pace of nature, to the rhythm of silence, to the sanctuary of stillness. And perhaps that is what makes these cold places feel so sacred, not because of what they contain, but because of what they allow us to release. Sleepwalking through history, carrying mysteries into dreams. As the night deepens and the world outside quiets, there comes a gentle moment when thought loosens from logic, when stories slip from their facts and become something softer, like mist rolling over a frozen field or the hush of snowfall on ancient stones. This is the threshold between waking and dreaming, a place not measured by time but by feeling, a pause, where the histories we've wandered through begin to change their shape, not because they are false, but because the mind, in rest, speaks a different language. It is here, in this place of half-remembered maps and distant echoes, that the cold mysteries we've visited do not end but continue on, reappearing behind closed eyes as drifting images and slow impressions. A ship trapped in ice becomes a lantern bobbing gently in fog. A vanished hiker's footprints transform into patterns on a frost-covered windowpane. The beauty of mystery is not that it disappears, travels with us, into dreams, into stillness, into that inner world where understanding isn't necessary for meaning to exist. All the places we've wandered across frozen lakes and abandoned Arctic towns, through silent forests and snow-covered airstrips, now fold into our imagination, like pages in a book gently closed for the night. But their stories do not vanish. They linger quietly, not to trouble us, but to keep us company. Like lullabies with no words, they hum softly beneath consciousness, not asking to be solved, but to be felt. These are not tales of fear or tragedy, but of presence, moments caught in time like frost held on a window before sunrise, waiting only to be noticed, not changed. In the hush of sleep, the world becomes wider and more forgiving, and mysteries no longer press with urgency. They become companions, slow and steady, reminding us that not all things are meant to be clear, and not all clarity is needed to feel. Connected, we carry them gently, like old stories told at the edge of a fire, softly, slowly, in no rush to conclude. They are the shared breath of history and dream, blending the real and the possible, allowing us to drift not away from truth, but toward a deeper kind of knowing, one that doesn't seek answers but welcomes the calm of unknowing. As eyelids grow heavy, we walk once more through the snow-covered valley where no path leads forward and none needs to. We stand on the deck of a ship long lost to the cold, not with fear, but with a sense of quiet honor for those who once watched. The same stars. We hear the wind brushing against an empty cabin door, and it speaks not of endings, but of memories resting where they belong. The hush of sleep mirrors the hush of those ancient places, both cradling something tender. To sleep is not to forget, but to return to a place where time bends and mystery holds no weight, where the ice does not isolate, but embraces, where silence doesn't erase, but listens. It is in this state, this quiet threshold, that history feels most human, not as dates and names, but as moments of wonder we carry inward, the footprints in the snow now become footsteps within the dream. The flicker of a torch becomes a candle in the corner of a resting mind. These aren't ghosts, but memories softened into story, and as we fall deeper into rest, we do not let them go, we take them with us. The cold is no longer cold, it is a blanket. The mystery is no longer something to solve, it is a song, one without lyrics, but full of feeling. One that hums the quiet truth that we, too, are part of the long story of those who wandered, wondered, and slept beneath stars they didn't always understand. There is comfort in that, deep comfort, like knowing the world doesn't need you to fix it before morning, like realizing that some questions were always meant to be carried, not answered, and so sleep comes not as an escape, but as a return to stillness, to quiet companionship, to the presence of those frozen stories that drift like snowflakes through our thoughts and settle gently in the corners of our dreams. Not to be resolved, but to remind us that we belong to something larger, something slower, something endlessly unfolding. In this way, we sleepwalk through history, not lost, but cradled, not afraid, but at peace. Each breath becomes a step through soft snow, each heartbeat a lantern glow on a darkened trail, and somewhere, just beyond the edges of the dream, the stories wait not to be told again, but to be felt, to be heard. In the silence, to be remembered without needing to be recalled. Because some stories are not meant for daylight, but for dreams. Some mysteries are not meant for solving, but for sleeping beside. And some nights are not just for rest, but for remembering the beauty of not knowing, and the peace it brings when we let the questions hum us softly into sleep. The blanket of time, embracing mystery over resolution. There is something quietly sacred in leaving the final page unturned, in resisting the impulse to solve every riddle or name every shadow. As we come to the end of this journey through time's soft, uncharted folds, what we are left with is not a clear map or a tidy summary, but a feeling gentle and persistent like snow falling slowly over forgotten footsteps, erasing the rush of conclusion. The mysteries we have passed through, from vanished explorers to ancient signals whispered into wind and ice, never demanded to be solved. They only asked to be witnessed with care. In their quiet company, we were not judges or investigators, but companions walking slowly beside what remains. There is peace in that, in knowing that some stories choose silence as their final word, just as time does not explain itself but continues, softly, steadily. So to do these mysteries move beyond the reach of certainty and into something deeper. Space where understanding is not measured by facts but by presence. We are not smaller. For not knowing, we are gentler, more open. There is a humility in standing before what cannot be grasped, a stillness that seeps into the soul like dusk settling over a field of frost. What matters is not that we decode every clue or chart every course, but that we allow the questions to exist unrushed, untroubled. For in a world that so often urges resolution, mystery offers rest. It reminds us that we are not here to fix the past, but to feel it, to sit quietly beside it and say, yes, you may remain unfinished, not because we gave up, but because we learned to listen. And in that listening, something changes. The ache to explain softens. The urge to control releases. What's left is a deeper kind of knowledge, the kind that comes not from answers, but from acceptance. Like watching the sea pull away from shore, not knowing where it goes, but feeling, somehow, that it belongs to a greater rhythm. Or hearing a melody hum through stone ruins, and not needing to know who first sang it, only knowing that it still sings. This is the blanket of time, not a burden, but a comfort. A vast, quiet presence that holds all things, known and unknown, with the same gentle patience. Under this blanket, we are not lost. We are part of something older than memory and softer than thought. We lie down beside ruins and find they are not ruins at all, but resting places. The ship frozen in Arctic silence, the footsteps vanishing into snow, the whispers echoing from mountain winds. None of them need to speak again to matter. They are here, and they are enough. And we who have walked alongside them through the hush of this narration are changed not because we found answers, but because we dared to dwell in the questions. There is a kind of bravery in that. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind, the kind that lets go, that allows stories to end without endings, that accepts that not all mysteries are puzzles. Some are poems, some are lullabies, and some are simply the breath of history exhaled once and still drifting. Tonight, as we fold this final chapter closed, we do not leave empty-handed. We carry with us a softened gaze, a quieter heart, and a deeper respect for what remains unsolved. This, perhaps, is the true gift of mystery, not clarity, but connection. A way to feel close to those who came before, not by knowing what they knew, but by wondering what they wondered. We are wrapped in the same sky, the same snow, the same slow turning of stars, and beneath it all, the same longing to belong to something meaningful. Mystery answers that longing not with definition, but with presence, with the quiet companionship of the unknown. So let us not fear the unanswered. Let us welcome it. Let it curl beside us like a gentle wind, a memory, a hush. Let it be the final light we see before sleep, the flicker not of explanation, but of wonder. In that flicker is peace. In that peace we rest. And in our resting we honor all that we do not know and all that we do not need to know, because here, beneath the blanket of time, every mystery becomes a lullaby, and every listener becomes part of the story, not by solving it, but by dreaming with it, quietly, softly, entirely.